Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the rest of you. We are back for another episode of Bitcoin Magazine Live. It is I, your host Q, coming to you yet again from my mother's basement, and I've been thrown up against the wall. And I'm joined by none other than my co-host P. How goes it in your neck of the woods, P?
As always, fantastically. I was just telling you guys, I got a rabbit tractor delivered for homesteading and stuff. It's going to be great. I'll be talking more about during this episode. We'll probably spend about 90 minutes just talking about that. But more importantly, we're also joined by Adam O, Denver Bitcoin on Twitter, who is a very vociferous miner and all around amazing dude. Adam, give us your intro. Tell us who you are. Tell the people who you are and what you're about.
Appreciate it, man. I appreciate the kind words there. I'm just a kind of a nobody out of Colorado with a loud dog. Sorry, guys. The timing's impeccable.
It's perfect.
Yeah, no, it's perfect. So I might have to go deal with him. But no, I'm a nobody from Colorado with a really loud dog that ultimately found my way into the oil and gas industry. And from there, I found my way into Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. So hold on, throw some ads or throw some intro. I'll go deal with him.
Go for it. Yeah. So Adam and I actually, we got to know each other on Clubhouse, and I can be a fairly intense dude myself, as all of us can. And Adam was always not only intense, but also extremely articulate about mining, oil and gas issues, the tearing apart the sort of the narratives compared to the actual facts. And so we hit it off and have been hanging out in virtual space on and off ever since, man. So super excited to discuss what Upstream Data is doing and really dive into kind of the mining space from his perspective and hear some of the on the ground issues that he and Stephen Barber are and everybody else on the team are really dealing with. They've kind of got a unique perspective as people who go into oil and gas fields, if that's the right term, and educate and discuss the issues involved with the actual people who are producing the or mining the oil on the ground. And so I'm super excited to dive into it. How's your dog?
I want to say it another way real quickly for my fellow bleeding heart liberals. Like, the work that they do is genuinely the most important work in Bitcoin and counter FUD. And it's vitally important not only to just understand what they have created, but the opportunities that have since been capitalized on by different oil and gas companies as a result. Like, this is right now, like, I would equate this to being like the best Avenger in fighting against the FUD that gets spewed around Bitcoin energy mining. Like, I'm a nerd like that, so that's how I equate it.
That's really kind. Those are really kind words. Sorry again for the dog, but what an intro. It's hard for me to even follow that. What I would say is this: I was certainly not an oil and gas maximalist or petroleum maximalist, which I would almost consider myself today. Before 2018, before I fell into the oil and gas industry, it was upon working in the oil and gas industry that I began to realize how this industry impacted everything in the world. How a slight tick in the crude price, which could have happened because there was an issue down in Texas because some guy got too drunk the night before and he showed up at a well and he caused a pipeline issue, and all of a sudden there's massive supply issues, and like literally this has global implications, all because what I realized was this is the foundation of all other industries. And when you think through it, it's not hard to see, right? When you think through, what are the luxuries we have today, and how are they enabled? It's really because of electricity. Like, electricity is the killer app to human flourishing, to humans living longer, having higher quality of life, better education, being more efficient, socially more efficient. Electricity is the key. And without electricity, without energy, we're in the dark ages. We're truly left to kind of be suckers of time, where we can't really be efficient because we can't scale, right? We just think about trying to travel without petroleum products. we're literally talking like horse and carriage kind of stuff, right? Or maybe we could talk about a steam engine if you want to go to coal, but that's still hydrocarbons, right? That's still a hydrocarbon. And so like we're in a place where I think it's time to have an honest conversation about what it means to impact the environment. Let's look at what role petroleum plays in impacting the environment, because keep in mind, before coal, we used to burn forests, right? Before petroleum, we used to go and get these certain oils and certain biofuels, bioproducts from living organisms rather than from dead hydrocarbons. We used to go get it from whales. Like whaling was a huge aspect of industry. And then we find petroleum and it's a joke, right? The cost is a joke. It's an inferior product. And at the end of the day, you have to kill living whales, right? Like, so I think it's time just to have an honest conversation. I appreciate the tip of the cap in terms of fighting the good fight. I think the money printer is really incentivized to push kind of a doomsday narrative. And in my opinion, I think it's a push to try to nationalize energy production, because when you nationalize energy production, I mean, then it's kind of over, right? It's similar to like nationalizing housing, right? If you nationalize housing, once you get one generation living under a national housing situation, like it's really hard to reverse that socially. And so, I mean, you need like a legitimate revolution, usually a kinetic revolution. And so, I think it's high time to have the conversation of, hey, what does it mean to impact the environment negatively? How do we accurately measure that? Because I think carbon dioxide is a bad measurement. And Bitcoin is one of these tools that really helps shine light on the dead weight loss that currently exists, right? The bad policies, the disincentives that shouldn't be there and the incentives that shouldn't be there either, right? The subsidization and the dead weight loss that's created. Bitcoin helps shine a light because it's this new market that energy producers can just export their energy to without permission. And so anytime there's an arbitrage where, hey, you're only going to pay me $2 for my natural gas, well, Bitcoin's going to pay me 14. So I'm going to push my natural gas over here. So that it's a natural market force that really can't be fucked with, right?
Yeah, we had a conversation with Alex Epstein, who previously wrote the Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And what's the title of his new book, Q?
Fossil Future.
Yeah. It was I love the Moral Case for Fossil
Get your
Fuels.
copy now.
I was gonna say, I got Moral Case for Fossil Fuels here. That's a great point, because this was a book that I read that was recommended to me by my boss in the oil and gas industry, and it was enlightening as hell, right? And it was one that was like, wow. It's not that it corrected a bunch of information that I had previously learned. It's that it shed light and corrected a bunch of assumptions I had about information I had previously heard, right? Because I never really spent the time to look at energy. I didn't know that Tylenol was a petroleum product. I never considered what it would be like to try to go to the hospital and have that hospital only run by solar panels or wind turbines. Like, do you want to be in the ICU in a hospital that is only run by wind turbines? I don't. Like, these concepts, I just hadn't considered them yet. And because I was living in the oil and gas industry, there was really two stark realities that I couldn't ignore, and I was kind of empowered by, right? I was kind of compelled to speak out about, which was, the first was, this industry had been vilified. Like the person I had in my head, the idea of who it was that was out there, producing crude oil and natural gas, was far different than who actually is out there producing crude oil and natural gas. Like, these are, in many ways, these are legitimate scientists, like geologists. Some of the smartest people in any room on earth are these people, right? Mechanical engineers, petroleum engineers. These are not people that easily buy bullshit. They run the numbers. These are number runners, right? They're much like Bitcoiners in the way that you tell them something, and especially with the internet, they're going to lifetime fact check you. And so these are really sharp people that I think that they actually think they're doing really, really good for the world, right? I think that they're providing an incredible service, because they are, at the end of the day, right? They're helping to power the world. And so their vilification, I saw, was just ridiculous. Like, it was like, okay, these aren't bad people. These aren't like these money hungry, like dudes in suits, like pushing black stuff out of the earth and just getting rich off it. Like, that was not, and for the most part, they were environmentally stewardly people, right? They did not want to destroy the environment. In fact, it was not in their best interest a lot of times, right? I mean, having bad things happen, having environmental issues when you're producing oil and gas is a bad thing. It's costly, right? It ends up destroying your formation, all that kind of stuff. And so ultimately, this was a stark reality that I was like, wait, first of all, this is not a bad industry. This is an industry that allows all these others. People need to know this value. Like, why don't we talk about, we're only talking about maybe the bad. Like, it's only a picture of an oil spill in the ocean. It's never like all of the beauty and quality of life increases and luxuries that we enjoy today that petroleum and natural gas bring us. So that's kind of what started I became a little cynical toward the mainstream narrative against oil and gas, right? I was in the industry, and so I had a stake in it. And so when they were attacking the industry, they were now attacking me. And so I felt this desire to try to defend myself. And I realized we had a really good defense. Bitcoin, though, the coolest thing, the part that I like about it the most is I think it actually gives these oil and gas producers a little bit of a pop in their step to defend themselves. Because pre-Bitcoin in the oil field, I mean, honestly, pre this last energy bull run, it felt to me like oil and gas producers had submitted to defeat to the ESG, the corporate ESG mob. They had pretty much capitulated. I mean, Exxon is building these offshore wind farms at incredible expense. I mean, I don't know how they justify that to their shareholders. It's, in my opinion, it's ridiculous. But like, now we're starting to see, for the first time that I can remember, we're starting to see oil and gas companies come out and say like, hey, like, don't you enjoy using a cell phone? Like, that's a product of hydrocarbons. Like, no data center out there is running on pure green energy, not any notable one at least. And so really this is just about discovering truth and shining light on it. And Bitcoin's a great tool for shining light on truth, right? I mean, look at what it does in the financial sector.
Well said. Very well said. Yeah, it's the disconnect between reality and how people view the reality of what's happening, especially around energy markets, is just astounding.
It's
enough to make a cynic out of anybody. You know,
it's enough to make a cynic, right?
Yeah. The what's that quote? Inside every cynic, or inside the heart of every cynic is inside every cynic is a heartbroken idealist. I feel like
a heartbroken idealist. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's fair, because I mean, it's what really is the most defeating part of it is to see something that's not the truth, like, win the narrative, like, win the day. And I think right now it's effectively won the day, right? And what is the narrative? I think it's important to identify it. And in this case, what I'm speaking about is, really the foundational concept that consuming energy, which is a weird term to me because energy never gets consumed. It just gets transferred, right? It just gets converted into a different form. But consuming energy or electricity is a bad thing, right? Like, I think if you walked up to people on the street, 9 out of 10 would, if you ask them like, hey, should people do their best to reduce their power consumption or reduce their energy consumption, people would be like, yeah, they really should. And it's like I would be the one guy that's like, no. Like, if they're willing to pay for the power, like, I don't care. Like, it's cheap and abundant power is a good thing. When you have cheap and abundant electricity, you have electricity that you can waste innovating. You can actually risk that very low cost. So you can risk trying to innovate. And I mean, think about the amount of hours and dollars that companies like Google and Facebook and stuff spend developing software, right? Well, you can't have software without hardware, right? You need hardware to run the software. And the majority of the hardware, it's a very, very quote unquote carbon intensive or hydrocarbon intensive process. And so, like, this 21st century we're in, right? I mean, this 21st century we're in of this interconnected world is a product of petroleum and natural gas and coal. Like why are we kidding ourselves? Without even discussing the Davos people, without even discussing their hypocrisy.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the people loved, and I hate this way of approaching the argument, because it ultimately, in my opinion, engages in a way that accepts the frame that you should be told how you are allowed to use energy that you have purchased. But it is, the cognitive dissonance is just, again, staggering when you tell people like, oh, hey, do you use a clothes dryer? Do you use a washing machine? Do you use a dishwasher? Because you are wasting far, far more energy than wasting, I should say, than Bitcoin does. But you're not wasting it. You fucking paid for it. You should be allowed to do whatever you want with it. So why are you suddenly fixated on Bitcoin specifically as a bad thing? And again, this is a sort of an orthogonal argument to the one you're making, which is ultimately like energy use is good, right? And of course, as you said, like a lot of these people are actually stewards of the environment, right? It's like we are beholden to maintain this ecosystem that we are part of and that we want to like continue to see flourish. But at the end of the day, you got to choose, as Alex Epstein says, you got to either be pro-human or like anti-human. And it's like that, those are kind of the two sides of the argument. And it's not as simple, or it isn't the case that if you are pro-human, that means that you are like anti-nature or anti-environment. They don't even necessarily need to be in opposition, but people just make it into this thing that it's not.
And isn't that crazy though, that it's almost a natural conclusion that we're parasites on this earth, right? That's kind of the idea, right? So it's like, and that's what I did a podcast with Lavera a little bit ago, and that was one thing that I wanted to stress on there was like, when you claim that energy use is going to extinct the human species inevitably, which is what ESG is about, right? It's talking about how we're not going to even be able to feed enough 500,000 people, let alone 1 million people, or let alone 10 billion people in 20 years, or how there's going to be sea level rises, and it's going to, at the end of the day, it's going to make the planet uninhabitable for humans, right? So that's when that is the issue, and that's the problem you're trying to solve. There are no means that are too atrocious, too abhorrent to justify, right? Like and the example I made is there are even those out there. I mean, I could spend 15 minutes on Twitter, finding a relatively mainstream person who would make this argument, or who probably has made this argument, which is, at first, they may not even be willing to admit that a lot of the renewable infrastructure, 100% of the renewable infrastructure goes through China, right? So China has 100% stronghold on the supply chain of solar panels, and mainly solar panels, but solar panels and batteries. Finally, there was many that were willing to admit that, yes, it looks like there was slave labor used in the manufacturing of a lot of these panels, right? There are some that, like, there are many that were like, well, that's abhorrent, that's unacceptable, that, that's way too much of a human cost. There's an S in ESG. There's others that would say, like, well, if the human species is going to be extinct, like, what's a few slaves? Right? Like, that's literally where we're going. What's a few, events of population control if we're talking about like saving the human species? And so it really opens a door to some crazy tyranny, some crazy Orwellian, like you said, like pretty much giving you an allowance, right? A carbon allowance is kind of what I see coming. And we saw it out of Davos, where I think it was one of the VPs of Alibaba was coming out talking about their device that they're producing that allows an individual to track their individual carbon emission score or whatever, right? And it goes from like what you eat to where you go, how you travel, where you travel, when you travel, all that, And so I'm wondering if it counts your breaths, because every breath I take, I'm exhaling carbon dioxide.
You better believe exercise is bad for the
exercise is, no, don't you dare get that heart rate up. Don't you dare. Take this antidepressant and sit on the couch,
Yeah. I mean, and the crazy thing too is that, like, using our energy efficiently and effectively is a noble goal. And it's something that I think we can absolutely aspire to as individuals and as a species. But again, then you get to decide, do you have an Xbox? You're going to have to get rid of that if you want to be, a valid member of society. And the other thing, you touched on this briefly, but the idea of using carbon dioxide as a metric is, as I understand it, and I know, to be honest, I know very little about it, but is fundamentally flawed in many ways, right?
I agree.
There are, maybe you can speak to this a little bit more, but there are far more harmful greenhouse gases, like methane, which we don't even talk about. And, I know it was a he's very unpopular in the Bitcoin community, but, Kevin O'Leary was talking about at Bitcoin 2022, the idea that, that companies that are trying to use carbon credits, which the idea behind is absurd on its face to me. It's like, oh, first of all, you have to accept the frame that, using carbon is bad, which we're talking about right now, and that's fundamentally flawed. But if you do, then the idea is like, oh, you can just spend money and like offset the the bad that you're doing just by paying money into some random thing. And the point that he was making is like, it's impossible to audit these things effectively. Like there is no real way of saying like, oh, you put this much carbon dioxide into the environment, but you paid these many dollars, and those dollars are then going straight into Elon Musk's pocket. And Elon Musk is a good guy because for whatever fucking reason, because solar, quote unquote. And so
Right.
like you're a good person now. Like you just patted Elon Musk's pocket. Like, good job, you.
I think this is carbon dioxide is a bad measurement, right? I think it's a bad metric. And beyond that, like, and it's important to have clear distinctions here. Like, and I'll speak toward carbon dioxide kind of versus methane, right? Like the way I look at it, methane is a bad emission, like to some degree. Like it's a pollutant to some degree in the sense that you can smell methane, right? I mean, it's highly combustible, but it's odorous, it's awful. It's like 75, 85 times heavier than CH4, which is, than carbon dioxide. And so like carbon dioxide is plant food, right? So like if you took like a forest, right, or a greenhouse, and if you had identical greenhouses next to each other in the same environment, if you put a natural gas engine into one of those greenhouses and we're running that exhaust, which is carbon dioxide coming out of that engine from burning methane, if you were pumping carbon dioxide into one of those greenhouses, what you would see is increased plant yield, right? It's plant food. Plants take in carbon dioxide, they emit oxygen. It's a beautiful thing. I mean, the Amazon rainforest does it all damn day. It's like a significant percentage of the oxygen molecules on Earth come from the Amazon rainforest and the thick foliage there. When you have an increase in carbon dioxide, what I think you have is an increase in plant growth and plant yield. Now, methane's not the same case, right? And so like there are places, Canada's a great example, where in the oil and gas industry, producers are able to vent, even not even flare, but just vent, right? Just spew CH4 methane into the air, into the atmosphere, as so long as they're venting less than 50,000 cubic feet a day, which is a significant amount. You could power about 150 kilowatt engine, which would be able to hold, 45 new gen miners. So you could plug in 45 S19s, right, onto this thing. And so up with if you had 50,000 cubic feet a day. Well, if they're venting that, that's an allowable amount to vent in certain places where there's no infrastructure for them to do so, right? They have no other option. They don't necessarily penalize them for that. It goes against their carbon score, their carbon profile, if you will. But if you set an engine there and you begin combusting the methane internally, well, the government shows up and says, well, hey, look, that's an engine, that's carbon dioxide coming out of there. Well, now we got to start fining you for carbon dioxide. And it's like, what the fuck are we talking? Like, this is a disincentive for me to take CH4 and combust it, turning it, like, very efficiently combust it and turning it into CO2 and H2O, right? Water and carbon dioxide. And so, like, there's a clear disincentive there. So that's a stark reality where measuring just carbon dioxide is flawed, right? Is objectively flawed, because if our goal is to measure negative environmental impact or air emissions impact, well, we've just fallen short of the goal. And so obviously we need to come up with a new system for measuring that. Carbon dioxide is not getting us there. And so I'm with you. Like, I think carbon sequestration credits, without even discussing the amount of fraud in that industry, right? I have a thread on Twitter where I spent like 30 minutes just Googling for people who had actually been like convicted, not just even, accused, but convicted of some type of scam leveraging carbon sequestration credits. And it's to the tunes of billions of dollars that people have been prosecuted and found guilty of. Some of them are just literally manufacture carbon sequestration credits, CSCs, out of nowhere. Like, they falsify them effectively. I mean, it's a fiat money to some degree. It's a fiat currency. That's what they did. Is they, what carbon accounting does is it creates a new column in the accounting book, carbon dioxide, and that's got a nominal value to it, and it can offset, real economic loss over here. And so we either, one of two things is going to happen, right? Either we're going to go down this path of tyranny where carbon dioxide accounting is going to become the standard, which, by the way, it has not always been this way. Like, this is pretty recent stuff. A lot of this air emission stuff, CO2 stuff, is within the last 15 years. And so it's still relatively early. So either we continue down this tyranny path of carbon dioxide, or we force a more honest conversation. We have to mock this nonsense and come up with a better way to measure what it means to negatively impact the environment. Because holding each other accountable, I don't think people should run out there and just blow up mountainsides to try to get minerals and things. Like, I think there is a level of accountability and a level of responsibility, but it doesn't look like, checking carbon dioxide box. That's not it.
Like a lot of this conversation, and one thing that I'm just gonna like flatly say, but I think we've kind of skirted around this, but the idea that all of these rules in place of like how much a company can emit, or just the process of creating carbon credits to legitimize Tesla and Elon Musk, which I fully believe was just an attempt to make the US investment in Tesla like seem better than it actually has been. Like these are all just made up arbitrary numbers by the people who do the measuring, are doing the grading, and they're grading themselves for the most part. Like, yeah, they're telling companies like do it like this, but they're not enforcing it to this point where it's like, hey, what did you actually do by introducing more carbon in the world? Did you just kill more people? Well, what's the repercussion for that? A slap on the wrist fine that's like less than pennies on the dollars you make historically and what you're doing now. So I'm with you guys on the idea that these carbon credits are just completely foolish, and the way that we approach just this idea of the carbon being introduced into the atmosphere, we have no sense of what that threshold is, and we've moved it enough times to where now it's just like
it's great. Those are good points. But what's funny is if you go a step further, right? So say you give them the benefit of the doubt, right? Like, let's say that, to some degree, let's say they're right? Let's say that carbon dioxide is going to destroy the human species, right? Are we then just going to just capitulate and say, okay, you're right. The only way to solve this is by giving regulators the power to try to, one, figure out what perfect atmospheric composition is. Okay, so can we trust that they even know what a perfect atmosphere would be like? And then two, achieve that atmospheric composition through policy and taxation, right? Like that is an absolute clown show of an idea, in my opinion, right? Not to mention, what is there, 209, 206 sovereign nations in the world? Right, we're going to need a one world government. This is a great reason to get a one world government, is because otherwise we're not going to be able to manage everybody's carbon dioxide accounting. Like, we're going to need a single body to oversee all these countries, supersede these countries for the sake of the human species, right? Like, we're going to need this. That's, again, it's all of these points predicate a very horrifying tyrannical argument, in my opinion. That's what scares me. It scares me that a future where I'm allotted carbon dioxide, credits based upon my virtue score or something of the nature. Like, that's a horrifying reality, right? Like, that's a reality where I'm like openly fighting against it, and like I'm rebelling. Like I can't tolerate that reality. And so I'd rather prevent it, right? I'd rather be proactive and try to start having an honest discussion, because like Alex, the one thing I really admire about Alex Epstein is he's willing to actually go put on a suit and tie and sit with a lot of these crooks. And he knows they're going to sit there and lie to him and ask him stupid questions and try to undercut any point he makes. And any word slip he has is just, they'll run with it for months. But he actually gets up there and he tries to have an honest conversation with dishonest actors, because in hopes that there's an honest audience. And I think in the information age, and this information age has really screwed over politicians. Politicians will never be as good as at the internet as we are. Like, we are way better at using the internet than the generation above us, and the generation below us will probably be better than us to some degree. But the information age is for ours, it's ours for the keeping, ours for the having, and ours for the using. And they'll never be able to really hide information so long as there's a kernel of truth out there. Like, people will find it, right? Because people seek out the truth. And so hopefully we can have a winning conversation, right? Hopefully we can talk about what's an honest way to talk about impacting the environment. And then beyond that, what I think we're going to find is whether or not that conversation gains traction, it's going to be forced to the forefront, because oil and gas companies are embracing Bitcoin to the nth degree, right? Like what you guys tweeted out today about, the Middle East coming in and talking about mining Bitcoin. Those of us like myself in this industry, we've been talking about this for years now. We've been talking about Saudi Arabia. We're talking about the entirety of the Middle East and the opportunity there, because everywhere that oil and gas is produced, gas is wasted. It's just a fact of the industry. And so there's opportunity, and at least they're waking up to it, right? And they're waking up to it a way where they can be open about it, right? When did you guys hear about that? I know you guys kind of broke the story. Did you, is there an actual article out yet?
There's an article on Bloomberg that we were citing,
Is
and
that what
I'm
it was?
sure that, yeah, I'm sure our news team will end up doing a deeper reporting on it. But just to read the quick little blurb: Oman's sovereign wealth fund took an equity stake in a U.S. firm that helps fossil fuel producers cut flaring by using stranded natural gas to power cryptocurrency mining instead. Geez, I wonder where I've heard of that before.
Right.
And it's Crusoe Energy Systems that they've
Of course.
put an investment in. So, I mean, it's interesting too, because I've told this story. Like, my younger cousin who just graduated from college, like, him and I were shooting the shit, talking about some stuff, and I brought up like this process of flaring off excess oil, and I explained like this was just wasted, like this was methane going into the atmosphere during this process. But now you have created an incentive for Bitcoin miners to find cheaper alternative energy sources, or come up with new ways to essentially create renewable energy. Like, that's in essence what has happened in this process. And there is this huge disconnect, I think, with society thinking that every single energy source that is possible has been created or invented. Because we haven't in our generation really seen innovation go from 0 to 1. We've seen a lot of innovation in this last century go from 1 to infinite. You see the iPhone, perfect example. That was built off of a touchscreen pad, which was built off of I forgot literally what the iPod was
iOS?
called, but the iPod.
Oh, the iPod.
No, the iPod built on top
Yeah.
of the cell phone, built on top of like your wireless phones, built on top of like your, like, this was just iterating over and over this product. And unfortunately, like, dude, the camera I'm talking to you on, the laptop I'm talking to you on, like, I'm very hard pressed off the top of my head. Someone throw it in the chat if I'm not thinking of a product in this millennia, since the year 2000, 2001, has anything really been introduced to us that wasn't just a reiteration or an improvement on something that was previously invented or created?
It was Bitcoin.
Okay, fine. I'm an idiot. And
I
I'm
was gonna say,
he was gonna jump in, yeah.
He's
But
Bitcoin.
like,
No.
you understand the point I'm trying to make is like, that's why
No,
it's
you're
even
right.
so
And
hard for most people to understand or grasp Bitcoin, because we, for a generation, for multiple generations now, have not seen the process of 0 to 1 really come to fruition.
I don't know, man. I don't think that's true. I think there's a lot of inventions. The internet, for one, the personal computer.
I mean, internet and Bitcoin, I think, are there, right? I mean, personal computer, it's like, I mean, that's the microchip, though, in a way. Like, personal computer was an innovation, you know, like, almost in a way, kind of like what you said, built on top. Like, what's interesting about power generation and energy production, though, is that, God, we have squeezed so much. I mean, because there's already been such an insane driving incentive force to create cheaper, more economic energy without using government dollars. Like, there has been an incredible amount of, you know, innovation. I mean, and I don't know if there's been much innovation on things like the internal combustion engine, right? Where, like, internal combustion engines are incredibly efficient, relative. I mean, especially for their cost when you look at the economics of it. And so, what the Trojan horse, I think, in terms of power incentives, energy incentives, is, you know, on a really long term horizon, I think nuclear, right? I think that if we're in a world where Bitcoin is valuable enough that, you know, it's like, where can I get that marginal better energy? I mean, nuclear is unbelievably economic on a long time horizon. However, you certainly can't erect and deploy nuclear, you know, small modular reactors without really abundant and economic oil and natural gas, right? Like, if you don't have a robust petroleum industry globally, you're not going to have a robust nuclear, you know, industry. Like, it's one happens before the other. One really provides for the other. Same thing with, I mean, I talk about this with wind turbines and solar panels. Like, I think solar panels are actually pretty awesome in terms of a sovereign way to produce power. I don't think they're saving the human species. I certainly don't think that they're more efficient from a carbon standpoint. I think that, you know, there's a lot to be argued there. But they're awesome in terms of sovereign power generation, right? Where I don't have to rely on a third party to generate some electricity. I can grab it from this giant nuclear reactor in the sky known as the sun, and it's awesome. So don't get me wrong. Like, I think that there's definitely a value proposition there, and something that's really empowering to individuals. But it's a petroleum product. I mean, you can't produce a solar panel. There's certainly not a photovoltaic solar panel without petroleum. And wind turbines I'm not really sure they ever have a place, but that's a epoxy resin. I mean, there's lubricants and steel, like it's all petroleum. And so you can't get rid of petroleum and hope to still have all this left over when it's made from petroleum. So that's like kind of one of these fallacies where it seems to me that it's more about, hey, we want to take over the industry, the nationalize energy production, and then we'll just use enough oil and gas just to make enough wind turbines so that you can have just ethanough power for your allotment of, carbon, whatever. And it's like the wealthy will be able to bypass that as they do today, right? Private jets in the EU aren't included in the new carbon tax, the new aviation carbon tax. Freaking private corporate jets excluded from that. Like, what the fuck?
Absolute horseshit.
Asinine. I mean, it's like asinine. And then beyond that, we've got, environmentally friendly surface to air missiles coming out of Raytheon. I mean, they literally marketed their surface to air missiles as the most environmentally friendly.
I know. I mean, what the fuck is happening?
That's a weapon of war.
I know. I feel like
what are we talking about?
There are so many things that I feel like future historians, because of course, like future anthropologists, future historians will have, unless there's some, massive apocalypse and like all the information stores get wiped out, we'll have this just treasure trove of insight into how we were thinking, right? Like right now, when we look back at, I think it was like Twitter. I mean, Twitter's going to be
Twitter alone.
Yeah.
It's a heck of an archive.
When we look back at like the fall of the Roman Empire, right? It was like you just have these letters from like, across the empire, people being like, yeah, it's weird, there's more bandits these days, but like everything's good. And then you look back and you like look at it in aggregate and you're like, oh yeah, like nobody had any idea what the fuck was going on. Whereas like, and that's like, but that's the highest resolution we had. We're like, oh, we found a clay pot that was broken and we are guessing that this person broke it in anger. Whereas like future historians will be able to be like, this fucking guy, like look back through like a single tweet and be like, it's going to be incredible.
No, and I hope they mock us. I hope they mock.
Absolutely.
I mean, if they don't mock us, then humanity has failed, right? Like if they don't mock some of the nonsense we're puppeting these days, the mainstream at least, right? What the mainstream word is just, it makes me feel like embarrassed to be a part of this generation almost, because it's like we're the first generation of the information age, right? We're the first to grow up pretty much with the internet, right? The consumer internet. I don't know about, everybody on this call is relatively young, right? So like, I do remember dial-up internet, but not too much, like a little bit, but really like we're here. We're the first ones that this is going to be recording. And these are the first boomer, these are the first older generation to ever be around when there was an archive like the internet with all of this misinformation, disinformation, and it's just information, right? It's some of it's bullshit, some of it's not, but you're right. It's going to be, hindsight's going to be really different going forward for humanity. That's a great point. Like just on a real macro level, right? It's too macro for us to almost care because it's outside of our lifetime. But this is a stark point of change. I talk about that with Bitcoin mining because, if you think about it, Bitcoin was intended to last a really long time, like hundreds, if not over 1,000 years, and the fair and not equal, but fair and open distribution of the supply of Bitcoin. Really, right, 90% 99% is in the first like 25, 30 years of Bitcoin's existence. Like, what a time to be alive! As we get to be alive during quote unquote like the gold rush of potentially a new monetary standard, an unbastardizable monetary standard. One of the things that compelled me to mine Bitcoin was just the fact that I could. That for like, when else in history
what a novel
did
concept.
you get to go produce a money?
Yeah.
Like, it was right. That was like literally like I was like I almost feel I would absolutely be remiss, and I would have many regrets if I didn't try to produce this new money. What a crazy kind of a deal, and then learn about it.
I
right?
think Jerome Powell is going to get upset and just go start the money printer.
So one thing,
if I was Jerome Powell, I'd print some money because you can.
It's all about the incentives. One thing that I do want to call out though is that, we've been ragging on sort of like the insanity of the ESG. What's the right word? not a apocalypse, because that implies that it's going to end in tears, and I don't think it will. I think we will triumph. But the ESG
kind of the
psyop.
doomsday narrative.
Yeah, the ESG
psyop.
psyop. I think it's also important to acknowledge, like, we all have to hold ourselves accountable for evaluating for our own critical thinking skills and evaluating the things that we promote and propagate as critically as anything else. There's an amazing article by Shinobi that we just published in Bitcoin Magazine that's Bitcoin developers have technical expertise that users don't. And it goes through the
Great
basic,
article.
it's fantastic. And I think it's so important because in the Bitcoin space, it is easy, honestly, to be very self-righteous and to be like, these motherfuckers. But I think we also have to turn the mirror back on ourselves and acknowledge that, like, we have to hold ourselves accountable for doing the hard work of propagating information that we understand, if not deeply, effectively enough that we are confident that it is true and that it is correct. Because I think, especially on Twitter, there's this pattern that has always been there, but it feels like it is more prevalent now, of people just sort of like repeating dogma, and even like pro Bitcoin dogma in specific ways. If it's the wrong, if there's incorrect information, it can actually be harmful to the ultimate success of Bitcoin. So I'm curious what you think about that, Adam, and whether there are areas in the oil and gas space where you kind of see a similar thing, separate from ESG, but things that are like, they're like good and that they're pro Bitcoin, but they're actually narratives that are dangerous because they're inaccurate or not true or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of them that's kind of strange to me that I get, I usually feel this way if I'm triggered, right, about something, because then either I don't understand something well enough, or I feel like the information's false, right? So like I'll go dive in. And one of them is, this one of these narratives that, I mean, it's about more about ESG, is that Bitcoin will naturally allow renewables to like win the day, right? Because because the thing with renewables or intermittent power is it's very inefficient, right? Sometimes the wind's blowing when people don't demand power. When it stops blowing, they need power. And so like there's these massive spikes, and there's a lot of electrical loss with both wind and solar. And Bitcoin's a great tool to come in and bring that energy to market when no one wants it, and provide it to the people when they want it, and have no loss or have less loss. But Bitcoin's an amazing tool. That's for all upstream energy production, right? It like benefits all energy production equally, where hydroelectric becomes more efficient, oil and gas becomes more efficient. And on an economic basis, like I even think there's plenty in the oil and gas industry that are ready to go to this, this place where they're still afraid to talk about how Bitcoin's going to incentivize more energy production. Like it's going to incentivize wells to be drilled, right? Where I mean, this is one of those things where when I give criticisms to like the Bitcoin Mining Council, when they produce, the nominal amount of energy that Bitcoin is consuming, right? And I'm like, well, that almost indicates that like there is a nominal amount that would be bad, and we're not at that amount yet, or something, right? Which I don't subscribe to that. What I subscribe to is you should always try to mitigate waste, right? Waste is a bad thing. Waste should be painful. Waste should be costly. But in a fiat world, we're incentivized to waste. We're incentivized to build products that only last 6 months, and we'll reiterate and build a newer, cheaper product on better financing next quarter, right? Like we're incentivized to be wasteful and to not be very stewardly. And then we turn around and like punish ourselves for being wasteful and not stewardly in this carbon scam. So it's like it's this weird dichotomy where Bitcoin already, just out of sheer existence, if there's oil and gas producers out there wasting natural gas, flaring natural gas right now that's viable for combustion, there's pain there. There's an opportunity cost there, where before there wasn't any opportunity cost. They couldn't get it to market. There was nothing else they could do. Hey, well, we've got good enough financing. Let's just drill for the oil. We'll blow off the natural gas and we'll flare it, right? Well, now it's like wasting any gas is painful. And so there's this natural incentive where oil and gas producers are going to be incentivized to produce more because they're more marginally efficient. But two, there's no regulation that is necessary for better actors. And so there's no reason to go harp on oil and gas, or like harp on regulators and be like, hey, you need to so pro Bitcoin that you subsidize us for mining Bitcoin, right? Like that we're going to swing the other way, where now it's like Bitcoin miners are going to be subsidized by tax dollars. And that's no longer an efficient market now, because it's really not about how economic your power is. It's about how good your deal with the government is. And so, that's something that happens a lot of times at scale, right? With these super giga mega facilities where it's like, well, they have to get in bed with regulators. And so they're going to get, they talk about the economic pull, and they make arguments for maybe going to another town. And so then the regulators give them they give them some of the tax dollars. And it becomes this, it's going to get chopped, right? Like there's going to become these forces of inefficiencies onto the Bitcoin mining market. It's starting to happen. But the Bitcoin mining market, because no one can really puppet string it, nobody can like pause it or say, hey, like think about when China banned all these miners, right? And the price just absolutely crashed. Hash rate was like on a massive free fall. It's possible that if something like that happens in 6 or 7 years, the government's going to freak out and like try to control the industry, try to prop it up, that would be a time where if there was some type of a council to like say, hey, we need to slow down, or like we need to stop the chain for a second. Like that would be the time that there would be intervention. And with Bitcoin, we don't want interventionists that way. We want a true raw market that's immutable. And so I feel we're going to see oil and gas producers, potentially go the way of the same thing the ESG czars did, right? Where they come in and they get in bed, and then they almost build up these high entry walls and keep out any competition just because they want that competitive advantage. They're going to try to leverage the state to do it. And so what I hope is, again, we check ourselves, right? Like, let's be honest. Like, no, this is like, we want a better means by which to measure how we're impacting the environment. And we want regulators to stay out of it, because Bitcoin already incentivizes us. It already hurts us if we waste, right? If we're wasteful, we're going to be financially penalized. Our competitors will beat us. They'll make more money with the same amount of oil and gas than we will. I mean, our days are numbered, right? And so changes the whole mind.
Yeah, it's crazy to me. The I feel like if you asked the average person, like, hey, do we live in a capitalist society? They'd be like, of course, America is like embraces the individual. But that's not actually true, right? Like America was founded on that idea, and I would say was more like that in relatively recent history. But these days, the United States distorts the markets that it participates in.
It's a corporatist system, not a capitalist. It's corporatist,
yeah, it's
right? It favors large corporations,
and specific ones. It's like there's the whole what is it, the the regulatory revolving door or whatever, where people go from like big business into Washington D.C. and then they pass laws that affect crony capitalism. Yeah, and
crony capitalism. Yeah,
and what's the other word? The other term is it's it's like socialized. It's
they privatize the gains, they socialize the loss.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and it's just so fucked up. I mean, like as a totally random example, because there's a million examples of this. I mean, the corn production system in America is insane. Like, you are paid to produce corn that you just do whatever the fuck with, and that's one of the reasons we have so much corn syrup. And I think that it's so unfortunate, because if we didn't have that system, farmers would then have to actually innovate and find crops that were much more interesting, or find ways of using those fields to produce energy or to produce food in ways that were more novel, and ultimately would make us more robust as a country, because we have some of the greatest farmland in the world. And it's just very unfortunate.
Well, not even that. No, I went to college out in Sioux County, Iowa, South Dakota area, and it's dairy country, it's ag country, right? It's soybeans and corn. And I loaded hogs in the morning and stuff, which by the way, hogs are, man, what a job. I prefer working in Bitcoin, to be honest.
I've only interacted with like actual like hogs, maybe for like a 6-month period of my life. I had neighbors at a hog farm, and they would like pay me when I was in high school to like go take care of them.
Did you burn your clothes?
Oh yeah, for sure. It was awful.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
more than that, the noises they make, man, they were like, okay, look, you just
Oh,
got to be warned. It's going to sound like humans are being tortured alive. Like that's just
yeah.
what pigs sound like. Like they
So you
just sound
feel like
like,
a bad person loaded. I mean, it's you feel like you don't feel good about it. It's like, at least if you have a heart for animals, I have a heart for animals. Like
me too.
I
Yeah, it was
like,
awful.
dude, like I can't, and they like scream. It's awful. But anyway,
Yeah.
loading hogs out there. Like I know a lot of guys that have a lot of farmland. You know, guys who their parents were farmers, you know, grew up on farms and stuff, and they actually get paid to not plant crop. Right? They get paid to sit and have that land just sit dormant for the possibility of planting it later. And then they say a lot of it's for regenerative, right? To like let the nutrients build back up in the soil and stuff, or so that they have X amount of idle farmland in the, you know, in the US, so that in case of an emergency, they could, you know, come take over your farmland, I guess. So they pay you a monthly check, but it's like hefty. Like they pay you more than what you would make for with your crop. Right. Because
That's
that's
wild.
kind of the argument. It's like, well, if you're going to make me not plant crop, like I could make, you know, 500 grand this summer with my X amount of acres. Like they're like, all right, we'll give you $1 million. And farmers are like, all right, for not working. All right. No, I guess I'll take, and I still own the land. Okay. Like, so that's deadweight loss, right? Like you said, there's many ancillary reasons, but there's many direct ways we can measure the deadweight loss that creates. Right. And I mean, you could just sheerly talk about just, you know, the idle resource. And then meanwhile, we've got food prices going through the roof and guys are getting paid to sit on their idle farmland. Right. And it's again, it's the government intervention is usually a bad thing. Bitcoin is the greatest thing for shining light on that. Like it's going to, the scary thing a little bit is that it's going to really shake up the power game. Okay. Where, I mean, the more I think about this, especially, you know, with the black box product at Upstream Data, which is, you know, the backyard Bitcoin mining enclosure, like
Oh yeah,
that's going to truly,
we didn't even talk about what that is. So the black box is basically, you know, ASICs,
yeah.
Bitcoin miners. They produce a lot of heat, and they produce, more importantly, a lot of noise. So it's very difficult, or not very difficult. It is a challenge to figure out how to have those in a way that doesn't, you know,
cause issues. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So
Like no, I mean, it's really like those are the two issues, right? Like getting rid of the heat and or I guess airflow and then noise. And one way to like to tackle both of those really quickly is to be able to put the ASICs outside, right? If you can like put them in a backyard, like even if they make a little bit of noise, well then there's nobody there to even hear it, right? But then also like ventilation's not an issue. And so that was really our goal. Was, hey, like how could we, you know, I begged my boss Steve Barber at Upstream Data to build what I call a backyard hash hut for a long time. And like, you know, we were too busy with our oil field stuff. He was like, I don't have time to design something that you're the only person who wants this product, you know? And so like it was on the back burner, but then come with these new generation machines and honestly, the earnings there, right? They just, the fact that new gen ASICs were earning over 35 cents per kilowatt hour for like 15 months. I mean, they were over 35, 50 months, but they didn't get any lower than like 18 cents for about 15, 16 months, right? So in the United States, average power rate's like 13 cents. So the average person could have been mining for the last, you know, those 15 months and been relatively profitable and at times very profitable. You know, spend $1,000 every month to make $4,000 in Bitcoin. Like, what would you pay for a machine that allowed you to do that? And so these ASICs got really expensive and stuff. So, but what we did is we just wanted to build the enclosure that would allow somebody to pretty easily put it in their backyard and not worry about damaging this really expensive computer hardware. And so what I've seen with that, and what I've seen with, because that it opens up possibilities now where like on a real estate kind of play, right? On a real estate point of view, where in a means by which to mitigate counterparty risk or even remove counterparty risk, you can invest in a you know, residential real estate property, even a commercial real estate property. And if you have Bitcoin mining in mind, right, if it's a low kilowatt hour jurisdiction, well, now you have another tool to leverage, right? You have access to cheap power. Well, a way to leverage that is to mine Bitcoin. And so you have this passive income from this business every month, or this you know, rental property that you're renting out, and maybe the renters don't even know there's two ASICs in the backyard, right? Like maybe you tell them power's included, you know, things like that. And so these numbers start getting run, and what it tells me is that if you zoom out, the United States is going to get arbitraged. Low kilowatt hour jurisdictions are going to come with a premium because it's easy to access the Bitcoin network. It's easy to mine, right? It's very low barrier to entry to mine Bitcoin, and you know, it's there's no counterparty risk. It's like you're not even selling your electricity to anybody. That's just pre-programmed to pay you out. So, you know, we'll see mining hopefully get extremely geographically decentralized, and the amount of stakeholders involved in mining will be, ridiculously, put it this way, unenforceable, right? Like mining regulations will become unenforceable when you have 1 million people mining in their homes all across the country, right? It's really tough to not only regulate that, but to even begin talking about regulating it because it's so pervasive at this point. And so with the black box, hopefully we'll see that, right? Hopefully we'll see a bunch of people that, like, if you have low kilowatt hour power, like, my gosh, there's an opportunity on, right in front of you, right, that you have access to, and people are waking up to that, right? Whether it's in the oil field, whether it's at home. And so, like, maybe what we see is, and I think in the long run, I think we see power costs go up all across the board, right? And then maybe in the mid to short term, like, the next 5-6 years, like we see kind of an abundance of energy production, and therefore, an increase in supply and maybe more competitive prices and things. But I think in the long term, we see more accurate pricing of energy, a more accurate pricing of a kilowatt hour, because globally it's being arbitraged, and energy no longer can kind of be subsidized by fiat money. We get a real, what is the real value of a kilowatt hour? Like, what would you actually be willing to pay for electricity? Like, at what point are you, like, paying attention to the fact that you're, like, leaving your TV on when you go to sleep or something, right? When it's like that, when those few kilowatt hours are so expensive that you actually pay attention to the energy you're using. Like, what's that number? I think we're going to approach it, because if we have a true free energy market, I mean, energy is not easy to produce. It's not easy to distribute. Bitcoin makes it easier, more economic, more predictable, but it doesn't make it easy. And so I think we're on a long-term run for a little bit of a reckoning. Like, I'm energy bull that way, right? Because I think we have subsidized electricity, subsidized energy for so long. People just think, like, they expect it. They expect cheap electricity. And
did we lose Adam?
I think we might have.
He's frozen at, like, the most inopportune time. But this seems like a perfect opportunity for us to quickly remind you, he's back. But buy your tickets to Bitcoin 2023. Tickets go up in price in 10 days. All right, Adam, back to you.
You cut out for a second, Adam.
Yeah, I thought so. I got a little warning on my my internet side. Sorry, guys.
Wait, or go ahead, and then I have a question for you about your background.
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
I mean, look, they're just trying to shut down your internet because we're talking about too much very serious stuff.
As always.
Too controversial always.
Is that a miner just, like, stapled to your wall over behind you?
It is. That's an Antminer V9.
A V9.
Yeah, that's it's hanging on. I got these kind of like ghost clips. They're good for hanging guns up too, but it actually fit this miner pretty well. And it's the first miner I ever plugged in. I used it does 4 terahash. Yeah, it's the first miner I ever plugged in. It does 4 terahash, and it pulls 1,000 watts. So it like pulls the same amount of power as an S9, but it's about a third as powerful on the earnings side. So it's
interesting.
Like you with free power, this probably isn't worth running. And it's a loud son of a bitch. Like, it's real loud. And I overpaid for it totally. I mean, $1 was probably too much for it when I bought it. But I think I paid like $100 or something for it with a PSU. And because I just wanted to learn what it was like. This was my, like, what the hell is this Bitcoin mining? I'm going to try this at my house. And the reason I bought the V9 was because Brains wasn't as flushed out, I guess, for the S9 at the time, the firmware that helps, kind of control the ASICs wattage. And with the S9, you still needed 240 volt circuit, right? So, like, a standard in the US, a standard household would work. The V9 will run on a 110. So you can plug this into any standard outlet. So I was like, I could run that. And I was, living in like a small apartment at the time, right? So
wait, S9s are 240?
Well, with Brains, you can get them down to on 110.
Oh, I see.
You can clock them down to like 900 watts, and then with an APW 3++, you can run them on a 110. You probably only can, like, run one. You can't, like, plug in two in the same.
Got it.
Yeah, but yeah, so, like, that came a little bit later, at least, or I wasn't sophisticated enough to even know that. I was still too early, and so when I was doing my research and I figured out the V9 could be plugged in, I was like, okay, I'll pay anything for one of those because I can plug it into my house. So I went on eBay and found one. And you know what I still want, though? I actually bought 3 of them, and I've been scammed 3 times. That's how bad I want one of these. I'm willing to get scammed 3 times because they're only like $50. But for one of those USB miners, those old school Bitcoin USB miners that are like, I want one that's in good condition so bad. I can't fucking find them anywhere though. So if you know anybody, let me know.
Bitcoin Magazine may have one.
Bitcoin Magazine might have one in the archives.
We totally do. We have one sitting in our office. We also have one of those. What was that thing? That company that was like, you're gonna have an ASIC in your fucking toaster, which is a cool idea.
Oh yeah, was that CoinMine?
It might have been. I honestly can't remember. It
CoinMine
looks really
came out with like the little PlayStation one.
Yeah, like, it looks dope.
Yeah, that it does. I mean, I looked for one of those too, but they were still selling them on the website. But they wanted like $1,000. And when I was looking, Bitcoin was like $8 or $9 grand. I was like, no fucking way, man. Like, no way I'm buying. Like a $50 USB, okay. $1,000 CoinMine, no way.
I'm realizing,
I was like, yeah.
We have this like
locked for it.
We have this locked display case in our office that, like, you know, it's sort of like the evolution of miners. You know, it has like a little USB miner, has that thing, and then it has like a, you know, actually, it's not even an evolution of mining. It has like a samurai node or something like that. Anyway, the point is, I'm gonna smash that glass, plug that shit in, and you know, just get that block.
Yeah, it's like 50 megahashes per second sitting there.
That's right. Break glass in case of emergency or whatever the thing is.
The glass case is probably worth more than the little miner, but unless it's to somebody like me, right? The collector value of it, like that. I mean, I have these. I'll always have a pristine S9, always.
So here's a random idea. So, you know, I've been the Nashville meetup scene is, you know, just straight fire. Awesome. You were there last time. I've been, you know, working with Odell and Rod and Mills, and we're gonna start doing some workshops over in the new Bitcoin Park, which is amazing. A PSA: if you are interested in coming to Nashville, make sure you plan it around the Nashville Bitcoin meetup. The content is just straight fire. And anyway,
and if you're like, I don't live in Nashville, go to the August one, because I'm going to go in August, and I'm saying this out loud on Bitcoin Magazine because Bitcoin Magazine needs to pay for my flight to Nashville to attend.
I mean, that just seems like a no-brainer. But here's my question for you. I have this dream, right? Like, you know, I know I mentioned a lot, but like PlebNet was something a bunch of us got together and we were like, we want to learn how a node works together and Lightning, and it was super fun. I want to be able to do the same thing, but with mining. And I'm like, is there like a warehouse? Can you buy miners like the one you have in your background that don't make sense economically, but that would be a fantastic learning tool to understand like how pools work? You know, what is the first of all, is that a thing, or do they just get scrapped immediately and like sent to the land, you know, the landfill or chopped up or whatever?
I'd say, okay, it's a thing for sure. Like what you have to find is one of the Telegram groups, right? So Steve Barber started a couple of Telegram groups like around home mining and like even our customer chat. And they are so dense with not only like great resources of people who would, you know, guys that would be like, heck yeah, man, like I'll shoot you my old miner so you can learn. I mean, I did the same thing last year. I sold like 70 What's Miner M3s to guys. And I sold them as cheap as I absolutely could to like cover shipping and, you know, be worth the hours of packing.
Yeah.
I like sold for like, you know, this is like the peak, you know, $60,000 Bitcoin. And I was selling for like $250 or something.
Awesome.
And I've had like 3 or 4 of those guys come back to me and they're like, yeah, man, like I started with that M3 and now I'm like deploying a megawatt out in Pennsylvania. Seriously. So like, it's not a joke, which is really cool. So definitely, you know, you could find those guys. And if you look at it as an educational kind of a thing, like you could probably get a miner, like an M3 or one of these for, you know, $200 or something. Like somebody be willing to, you know, like it's not, if it works, like, you know, they're probably not running it because
of course,
like,
just sitting in a warehouse.
Power makes no sense. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What I hope for, what I want to see, because so this is the cool thing about the ASICs, right? Is that we used to have this progression, like you talked about, and guys used to talk about how you have to always get the newest thing, but we're now at the place where these are the machines of tomorrow. Like we are at the future, in my opinion. Like we're not going to get much more efficient than the S19 at 29.5 watt per terahash. The Hydro is like,
what makes you say that? Because there's the limitations of 5 nanometer and 7 nanometer chip manufacturing.
Well, just the limitation, just diminishing return, right? Like it's so much harder to move from 5 nanometer to 3 nanometer, and the return you get, it's like, you know, okay, so what? We're gonna move from 25 to like 19. Like, okay, so that's about what, 17% or 20, almost 20%. Like, okay, like we used to jump with ASICs. It used to be like 1,500% or 7,000% increase. Like if it's just a 15% increase in efficiency, I might have 15% cheaper power than you. Like, you know, so we're kind of at the future, right? These ASICs are very computationally dense and power dense. What I want to see, and I want to be recorded as one of the first people talking about this because I know it's going to happen, is
This is
I
the
want to see
permanent
somebody.
record, so you're good.
This is the permanent record, right? I want to see somebody take an S19 and just take one of the boards out and build an ASIC around it.
Holy shit.
Or an S19, effectively take two of the boards out of an S19 and run it with just one board, because then you have a unit that only pulls as much as an S9, like 1,000 watts, but it's doing like 35 terahash. Like that's a home mine, right? And now you only have one board to cool. And so you don't need fans that scream to 7,000 RPM and are super loud. Like if you have oversized fans, they probably are running at 4,000 RPM, able to keep that one board cool, right? The only problem is the economics of this, right? That you would need 3 PSUs, because you need a PSU for each board. So the economics are a little rough there. But I think if we can figure out a way to repurpose S9 PSUs, the APWs, for something like this, I mean, if you could plug it in, like you could plug in a 110 outlet, a single board that's like as efficient as an S19, it's only pulling 900,000 watts. Like that could be an amazing space heater. Air cooled would be totally sufficient, even in super hot temperatures. Like you don't even need to talk about immersion and water cooled. And so like now I think we're at the place where maybe we can start tinkering with the hardware, because it's going to last so much longer, right? Because we can actually plan for the future. We could repurpose these boards and stuff.
Dude,
and so,
I fucking love
3D print your own freaking frame, pull the board out, right? And buy these fans off of Amazon, clip them on, and boom, you've got yourself like a single, just as efficient as an S19, but it's like, it's a 1/3 of an S19.
I mean, wait.
I think, yeah.
I mean, how difficult would that be though? So I know nothing about the electronics of an ASIC
Tough.
miner.
I don't. It would be easier with WhatsMiner, because right now the new gen WhatsMiners, if you have a bad board in your WhatsMiner, you can pull it out and it'll run with just 2 boards, right? Like so, it's effectively like you can effectively pull out 2 boards and just run it with one. Now you would want to put something in the place of where those 2 boards were, so that the airflow is right. Otherwise, least resistance and the one board gets too hot.
Yeah.
But if I could 3D print a dummy WhatsMiner board, like literally, I'll show you. I've got one right here. So like, this is a bad M31S board.
Wait, we can't see it. Oh, there you go. Yeah, okay.
Right. So like this just literally, if you think about like the ASIC, the way like that's oriented, this just like slides into the WhatsMiner, right?
Yep.
And so if I could just 3D print this just to take up space, so then I could slide it in and take up the space of those others, like I effectively have that. And so now the only issue is I have 2 boards sitting out and I need PSUs for those and things, right? So then it's like, all right, let's go out and buy a whole bunch of PSUs for cheap, like repurposed ones, used ones. And like I've thought about just trying to make this product, because I think on the home mining level, as a space heater, like an S19 is overkill for a lot of people. Like it's way too much heat. This would be like, it'd be an S9 that's as efficient as the new gen stuff.
Now I'm having this whole like elaborate fantasy. Like it's like, there's like setting like 1, 2, and 3. And it's like, you're like, oh, I need some more heat in my room. So you're like, it's like you're on one board, you turn it to 2, you turn it to 3, and it just like automatically like intelligently switches between the various boards. It'd be fucking amazing.
Exactly. But it makes sense for people to actually go out and build that future now, because this hardware should hang around, right? So maybe we'll see guys like CryptoCloaks, come out with a 3D printed freaking shell or something. Maybe we'll see guys try it. I think it's worth the time. I think you could literally come out with the new ASIC and you never even produced a microchip. Like you never even had to like draw a circuit or manufacture it. You're using Antminer stuff and making it better. Like it's kind of like what Brains does in a way, right? So I think there's opportunity there. Exciting stuff.
Love it. Okay, Q.
Yeah.
Adam and I have been going for a while. What questions do you have for Adam? I've been monopolizing his time.
I've been sitting here learning so much. I want someone like genuinely, whoever has an M3 or a shitty miner you're not using, shoot me a DM. I will buy it off of you. I've got my summer project now laid out in front of me. You guys just keep talking. I'm going to chime in. I'm going to take P's role on this interview, and I'm just going to talk about the elephant dick in front of P's face. But
actually, we learned recently, Adam, that so this is an Electro Voice RE20. It was invented in like the fucking 50s, but it's like
that microphone.
Yeah. So everybody uses like a Shure SM7B, which is the one that like Q has in his. And I was like, no, I need the old school from a gentler time.
Just wanted an excuse to say dick
from a gentler time, a pre-fiat time.
Yeah, exactly. But I was recently told by our incredible videographers, Pleb Music and Max.
Aaron.
No, Pleb Aaron. Aaron is Aaron. Pleb Music is Pleb Music. Anyway, point is they're fucking incredible. And they were like, yo, you know that in Germany that microphone is called the elephant dick. And I was like, that seems appropriate. It's elephant dick colored and it's gigantic. Like you see me this entire time like trying to figure out like, how to get it
Did
in
you
my
guys
mouth.
know? Okay, two random things that I do have a question for the two of you.
Yeah,
Did
yeah.
you know elephants cannot jump? Like, I'm
Yes.
surprised.
Yeah.
I just learned this fact.
Isn't it like cows can't walk downstairs?
Can they
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 not?
can walk. Yeah, they can walk upstairs, but they can't walk down. So like the
I
whole
think
like
that's
high
right.
school prank is to like get a cow and like put them in like the second story of your high school, and then they have to like get a crane.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. I think I
amazing.
have heard that. They also, yeah. Ungulates, they're
Yeah.
hose, man. They're all fucked up.
I like Old Faithful. Get two pigs, number one, number three, and they'll never find number two. But I'm a simple man with simple pleasures.
Yeah. Not. Yeah. Sorry. Go on. What was the second
I
question?
mean, truly off topic until I ask you the on topic question, but maybe we'll dive into this one later. But you guys hear about the radioactive sharks that were found recently?
Well, so radioactive, I think is a strong word. Yes, I did look into this. Okay.
I'm being very liberal with the use of radioactive.
Yes. Radioactive is strong. They're acidic sharks. They're living in there was a underwater volcano, right? That
Oh, I did read about this.
erupted.
Yeah.
Super sulfuric environment. Like literally, it's like the water is damn near like gonna hurt you to the touch, and like there's a bunch of
It's super
like,
poisonous.
yeah, super poisonous. They found a bunch of like fish and sharks that are like just hanging out in there. Like, okay, so yeah, I mean, it might as well be radioactive at that point, right? I mean, that's like a cockroach with what they're able to live in. Like, that doesn't make sense to me.
I'm a huge fan of KFC Barstool, and I loved his tinfoil hat theory that this is actually a ploy by the American military to train sharks to combat and fight against the Russian dolphins that fight in the Russian Navy, which apparently is also a thing I learned about today. I learned a lot of animal facts this morning.
Today I learned there's apparently a dolphin navy for the Russian government.
No, dude, there's
they're fighting against Ukraine right now.
Sea lions. The United States uses a lot of sea lions because they're extremely intelligent and they're very good at finding things underwater. So we use like sea lions for detecting mines and stuff. You can,
Really?
dolphins. Yeah.
Wow. Today I learned that though. That's real. I will say one thing about learning mining, P. Like you mentioned about like, is there like pleb debt, by the way, is awesome. Like such an awesome deal. I mean, like I think the amount of people that learned about kind of what Bitcoin is from that is probably immeasurable. So like kudos to you guys on that. That was always kick ass. For Bitcoin, what's interesting is like, I think it'd be a little anticlimactic in the sense that like nodes and Bitcoin layer 1, layer 2 is so much more complicated than mining. Like mining, one of the things that that's so crazy about it is how easy it is. Like when you it might take you 30 minutes or an hour the first time you like set it up, but like the second it's set up, like you're literally sitting there like, okay, I'm done now.
Find that Bitcoin, do it.
Like I literally don't ever have to like log into this thing ever again. Like it could unplug and replug 50 times. I never have to do anything. Like it's configured. Like it's almost at that point you have to begin understanding the economics. So you start watching the numbers and stuff. So it's a little anticlimactic, but what it does make you realize is how this Bitcoin thing that we all value for many reasons, right? There's a ton of people that are going to value it for exactly just this reason. Guys that produce energy, power, electricity. This is going to become a very common, it's sexy right now. It'll become very unsexy, in the next 5-10 years. Like it'll become the standard. If you're generating power and you're not mining Bitcoin, you're just inefficient. Is usually what, that'll be the natural conclusion. And so then what happens is while the learning about, actually how to mine maybe a little bit anticlimactic, the part that's tough to shut off, at least for me, was, laying in bed at night and realizing that anywhere I could find economic power, I had a massive opportunity on my hands. I had asymmetric information as to how to monetize that. And that's hard to shut off. Like you start driving down the road and seeing gas stations that are like abandoned and you're like, can I drop an ASIC in there? Like it starts getting,
I love it.
It's insidious, right?
You're like the guy in the Matrix, he's like, I don't even see the code anymore. I just see blonde, brunette. You're just like, anytime you see an empty outlet, you're like, yo, do you need that outlet? Can I take care of it?
I walk into the grocery store, and they have those heavy, like the way that big grocery stores and warehouse buildings, the way that like Costco, the way they heat themselves is they make like a hot air barrier at any opening. They spending a ton of electricity blowing hot HVAC on that opening. So when you walk in, it's like you walk through a blow dryer, right? Like I'm sitting there like, why the fuck aren't these people mining? I just have a whole bunch of ASICs just pumping, like get rid of your HVAC units, man. Like lumber storage yards, they need really like a lot of hot, dry air. I'm like, why do they have HVAC anymore? Like, so like I've gone down that rabbit hole, and it's seemingly endless because we are so wasteful with it's so disruptive. It's gonna get annoying. It's already almost annoying how many places, you know, mining synergizes with.
I got an annoying question that's like, we're gonna detract a little bit from the mining as we wrap up our conversation with you, Adam, because I know you do have a hard out. I want to present a question to you that like it's become a topic of conversation, I think, in my day-to-day life too much, but it's the 80-20 principle. And I'm starting to get to this point where I don't know if the idea that everyone is going to adopt Bitcoin is even like a realistic goal. And I think just historically speaking, with the 80-20 principle, it feels like what will eventually and inevitably happen is there'll be 20% of the population that really understands things like mining to the extent that you do, or just understands like, ooh, there's a spider next to me and I do not fuck with spiders.
Sorry, dude, we got to get like a clip of that. Your eyes like you like looking like your eyes grew.
Just out of
It's so
terror.
embarrassing how small it is, but like anyways, 80-20 principle, where do you stand on the idea that like everyone needs to understand Bitcoin on a real deep level versus like people just need to know how to use it? Because like, let's be honest, like most people turn on their car, they don't know how the fuck that happened.
That's a good question. You know, I tweeted about this. I think Michael Saylor said something about this a few days ago, and I remember retweeting him, and I said something like, I said the ratio of people who have heard about Bitcoin to the people who have what I would call, you know, an intimate understanding of Bitcoin, like that ratio's got to be like 1 to 100,000. Like for every 100,000 people that hear about Bitcoin, somebody like intimately understands it. Maybe 1 to 10,000. I'm not really sure, right? Like it can't be great, but put it this way: the more people that understand Bitcoin, then the more people will be inclined to understand money and energy, right? Well, what did Nikola Tesla say, right? If you want to know the secrets of the universe, think in terms of frequency, energy, and vibration, right? Energy, frequency, and vibration, or something like that. Like that's the keys to this universe. Really, the way in which not just humans, you know, society, how we operate, but really the ticket to understanding true cost is to understand at least a little bit of thermodynamics, understand energy production, because the only energy or the only currency in the universe is energy, right? We have a bunch of things to represent energy. Proof of work is, you know, Bitcoin is one of those amazing things that it's so tightly correlated to energy that I think it's one of the best representations of energy work exerted. But we have other things like food, like a Snickers bar is energy, a gallon of gas is energy. And so, you know, meanwhile, we have tons of pricing nonsense between all of these different types of energy. And it's easy to begin to understand inefficiencies and you know, dead weight loss and things like that when you think in terms of, you know, kilojoules, and you think in terms of what is the raw input here, right? What is the energy exerted? And so the more people that understand Bitcoin, the better. How many people need to understand Bitcoin for it to win, or for Bitcoin to be pervasive? It's not, I don't even think it's a matter of that. It's just a matter of time. People will understand. Like, people will come to understand it because they're incentivized to come to understand it. Because they'll be monetarily incentivized, right? If you dangle value in front of people, enough people are going to come forward, right? And so that's what Bitcoin does. It kind of incentivizes people to learn about money, which one of the most beautiful things about it, because people don't know about money. I mean, I have a college degree, and I mean, I understood Keynesian economics really well because it was my degree. But even then, I didn't understand the nonsense that goes on with the Fed and with Wall Street and with, you know, bond ratings and all. Like, you don't learn that kind of stuff. You have to go out into the world and you have to kind of care to investigate. And hopefully Bitcoin will be that thing where people say, well, Bitcoin's a scam. And when they get enough pushback, maybe it's not, or they see the price go up and they missed out on the scam. Well, then maybe they'll have to check themselves and be like, well, hey, what did I miss? And they'll have to go learn about Bitcoin. And in learning about Bitcoin, to try to poke holes in Bitcoin, you have to learn about what are we using now? You have to learn about dollars, right? And that whole educational process, I mean, that's how we become better as a species, as a civilization, as we enlighten ourselves, right? Bitcoin's a tool of enlightenment, all right? It's a signal toward truth. So even if it's only 20, that's 20 more than I mean, I'm grateful for the 20, and I think the world will be a better place for it, right? And Bitcoin will be successful, and because Bitcoin is sound.
Just like a quick reminder that 20% of the global population right now would be about 1.6, a little bit less than that, 1.6 billion people who would, in theory, then understand Bitcoin, which would be absurd.
Yeah, Facebook has 2.5 billion monthly users.
So I think we'll be just fine if the entire world is using Bitcoin. And, oh no, you can't disappear. Fuck. Okay, I gotta go deal with the spider before it goes hide somewhere.
All right.
I will.
That's all right. That's all right. I had to deal with my dog.
I got a quick question, Adam. Great conversation as always. Actually, you're not the only person to say Bitcoin mining is kind of anticlimactic. We had Econo Alchemist on a few weeks ago, and he said aside from just basically putting in like I think it's your IP address or routing it to the pool, it's pretty easy. After that, you're like, okay, what else do I do? So I guess I want to touch back on something that you said earlier, that basically with the iteration of miners that we have, like basically it's very minimal or diminishing returns, the amount of I guess efficiency we'll get in the miners. So to your point, do you think a lot of the innovation comes around finding stranded energy sources, finding the use for the heat, finding the use for, I don't know, sound as much as a use case, but I know a lot of people have cool things of using it to heat hot water heaters or using it to, like dry mushrooms. I think Mags from CoinKite was like using her ASIC to dry mushrooms and stuff. So I guess if you want to expand on that at all.
No, I think that's a great point. Like, yeah, I've said it before. I think that the first decade of mining was all about squeezing the most out of the silicon, right? Getting the most out of a kilowatt hour, the most computational work, right? It's all about innovating at the ASIC. I hope, and what I think the second, this decade of mining will be is, yes, people seeking out stranded and waste energy sources, right? Undervalued energy sources. But beyond that, I hope to see firmware, right? Like one beautiful thing about Brains is, I mean, there's not very many people out there doing it either, which is crazy, is, Brains gives you this ability to, it makes your hardware better than it was nominally rated for, right? Either makes it more efficient or more powerful, right? Maybe it sacrifices some efficiency for power, or it sacrifices some power for an increase in efficiency, right? Gives you some of that optionality. I hope to see, competitors, right? I think it's really hard what Brains is doing, but there's a massive reward. If you make a firmware that makes my ASIC 10% more efficient, 15% more efficient, and you incentivize me to join your pool, like watch me jump, like as a miner, watch me take that incentive and run with it. And so, yeah, this decade is going to be about honestly, I don't know if it's getting away from the grid, but it's getting, it's pocketing into the places in the grid, even at the residential level where power is cheap and wasted, and going away from the grid to find waste of power, but then optimizing that long-term efficiency on the operation side, right? Like, how do we reuse the heat? And so if we're drying mushrooms and part of our process is selling those mushrooms, now we're subsidizing our own other operation over here, right? And so just a matter of that marginal efficiency gain, right? Everyone's going to try to be just a little bit more efficient. Where I think in the oil field, like I said earlier a little bit, is one of the greatest use cases is, hey, build a greenhouse out in the middle of North Dakota and you can grow all winter, right? You can use the ASICs to keep the thing warm. You can pump in carbon dioxide from the natural gas engine and give your plants a really dense carbon dioxide environment where they're going to have big plant yield. Like, Alaska literally will pay you to come to Alaska and farm, to try to do greenhouse farming and take risk doing that, because they have produce insecurity, right? Alaska doesn't produce enough of its own vegetables and fruits. Massive opportunity. Guess what else they have? Tons of oil and gas and tons of wasted gas. And so these synergies will come together because like now it's, not about getting that next ASIC in order to be profitable. It's about, hey, on a 10-year span, at this level of computational efficiency, these are commoditized. Everybody's got the same tools. Who can compete? Guys with the best power, guys with the best idea, I guess. Right. But that's a great point, Chris. Like it's worth mentioning how you can subsidize yourself just by increasing your own efficiency, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I'll pass it over to Q&P. I think we got to wrap in the next 4 minutes or so.
Yeah, Adam, I'll let you tell everyone how to stay up to date with you, how to, hear about what else you got going on, where you're most active.
Yeah, I'm Denver Bitcoin on Twitter, but definitely check out upstreamdata.ca. That's our company's website where we build enclosures for the oil field. We build engines for the oil field. We also build an enclosure for the backyard. Back to what P said earlier a little bit, I want to definitely give a shout out to Rod Bitkite. His handle is Bitkite on Twitter. If you're in Nashville, you're going to be in Nashville, like definitely give him a follow. I loved hanging out with Rod down in Nashville and listening to his vision of what he hopes to help, cultivate in that city, and to see how he's started to execute on it. I was blown away. And I'm one of the biggest proponents of that meetup. That was a really cool experience, really cool to see. Odell's always just classic and produces great content, but really excited to like see how that blows up. So definitely check him out. Beyond that, I'd say, follow guys like Alchemist, who on Twitter have produced so many free resources that have helped me. They still help me. They'll help me tomorrow. Probably I'll have a problem where I'm going to turn to an econo blog. So definitely check him out and the other guys at Upstream Data. So other than that, I guess I'll see people next time on either at the next Bitcoin conference or on the next Bitcoin live stream, right?
I mean, amazing. Adam, I'm letting you know now you're going to be invited back. So just
stuff,
be prepared for like this. You're too great. You're awesome. We're going to go catch a Dirty Heads show sometime, and I'm amped for that.
Yeah, I think P is one of the funniest human beings in this space. Like I sat in line to get some pulled pork with P for it was like an hour-long line, and I was like rolling on the floor laughing. I didn't even realize how long I was waiting for food. So I'm always blessed to hang out with you, man. I always get a kick out of shooting the shit with you guys.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Always.
All right. And thanks again, dude.
Before we cut to a commercial break, Adam, you're free to go. You don't need to hear me shill everything.
You're good, man. You're good. Cheers, guys.
Quick shout out to Eastside Tony, who did post a picture of his original miner from like 8 years ago and tagged all of us. Love you, bro. Love that. Of course, Bitcoin 2023 tickets are on sale now. Lock in these lowest prices available. Ticket prices are going to be going up next Friday, I believe, or is it the following Friday? No, it's the following Friday. So you have about 15 days, 16 days. I don't want to hear like, oh, tickets are too expensive.
Nobody
Just
sounds
buy
like
the
that.
damn ticket. I mean, that's what P sounded like when he was complaining about how expensive the ticket prices were like 2 weeks before the conference. But
that's true. You're right. Actually, that is a just picture perfect impression. I understand what I said earlier.
Use promo code FOMO, get 10% off of everything at the Bitcoin Magazine store. We're going to cut to a quick commercial break, and we're going to do news and notes. What's up? We're back live, dude. Also, like, before we dive into news and notes, it has been, fairly slow-ish. There's going to be some really awesome stuff we're going to bring up. But, like, seriously? Like, that spider just interrupting me mid-question? So unprofessional. Not cool, guys. Not cool. Whoever put the spider in my room, fuck you. I want to start with this fun little piece of news. Solana. That decentralized network that's supposed to be the Ethereum killer.
You got to put giant air quotes
decentralized network.
when you say that.
I need to really emphasize this decentralized network.
It's the most centralized.
Well, before we spoil, Pete,
you
told the punchline.
Fuck. Keep going.
They shut down the fucking network today. Like, what? How can you look anyone in the eyes with a straight face and say, this is a decentralized network? Oh, by the way, I have the kill switch. I can turn it off. This isn't the first time this has happened to them, right? Like, this has happened before. I remember reading things just, oh, Solana's down or whatever. Like, the Bitcoin network doesn't shut down. Sure, an exchange might have a hard time fulfilling your request when everyone's trying to smash by at the same time, but the network itself continues to operate, and it further exemplifies this issue exemplifies the reason why decentralization of the network protocol itself and not having this like kill switch is so instrumentally vital to the future of sound money.
Yeah, and I will conflate too. I mean, the exchanges might have issues, but when you have Bitcoin and you're doing it in a peer-to-peer fashion, there is no issues. I guess the only issue, quote unquote, they might run into is the varying fees, but you can even get around that if you have Lightning channels open. So while main chain is very expensive, obviously Lightning is normally, P would probably know better than me, but I believe it's a flat rate normally.
Well, so the Lightning fee structure is, there's two aspects of it. There's the base rate, and then there's also the like it's basically it's like fee per million ppm. And anyway, the point is Lightning fees are extremely low, but even on-chain fees are extremely low. And I do think it is important to disambiguate those two things. An exchange is actually a type of layer 2 technology. It exists on top of Bitcoin or separate from Bitcoin and allows you to sort of interact. Layer 2 might be a bit of a stretch, but I certainly think of it that way. In that it interacts directly with main chain Bitcoin, but it's doing a separate thing. They have their own ledger. They're doing their own separate thing. Regardless, Bitcoin as a piece of software, as a network, has one of the I believe it has one of the highest uptimes of any piece of software like in history. It's like 99.999, percent uptime. It hasn't gone down in something like, it's embarrassing that I don't know this figure off the top of my head, but it's like over 10 years. And maybe even, it's probably even more than that. So that's what you get, as you were saying, Q, from a truly decentralized piece of software that is designed specifically from the ground up to be censorship resistant, to be peer-to-peer, and to be set up in such a way that it is very economically easy to run your own node, because nodes are the backbone of the Bitcoin network. And they communicate, peer-to-peer, and basically relay information and validate blocks and do their own thing. Ethereum is very centralized. There are people that can control large swaths, if not the entire network. And in order to run your own, it goes back to like people like fucking around with the terminology. So in Bitcoin, you can run a light client, which then like relies on another full node. But to run your own full node is something like, let's say it takes like 4 gigabytes of space, maybe a little bit more now. And basically you have the entire blockchain. You can go back and look through every single transaction that has ever happened on the Bitcoin network, all the way back to pizza day, when Laszlo bought, a pizza for whatever it was, 2,000 Bitcoin. And in Ethereum, if you want to do that, if you want to have a node that has the entire blockchain, they change all the terminology. They're like, oh no, that's not a node, because not like there's like 7 in existence. They're like, that's an archival node. And basically they like create this whole new terminology for essentially trying to like make Bitcoin seem not as amazing. And it takes tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, to run a full Ethereum node. And to run a full Solana node requires an entire data center, like straight up like $500,000 at minimum to basically like set up your own Solana node. So yeah, they can shut down the network like that. They just basically turn off. There's like, I don't know how many network operators there are that are actually running quote unquote Solana nodes, but they can just flip the switch and be like, yeah, this network is down now. No transactions can happen. Everything is frozen. If you have assets on this network, get fucked, because now we've shut everything down. That can't happen in Bitcoin, and it never will.
Yeah, I think Solana, I looked this up. I think they had 16 nodes, because to P's point, you basically need to run a gigantic data center. So 16 nodes at $500,000 a piece would be about $8 million that is just basically holding up or propping up this entire network. It could be more. I don't know. I don't look into it that much, but I remember it's sub 100, which is not fully decentralized, even if it was 100.
It's extremely crazy. Not decentralized. And each of those, like, let's say like probably like 30 of those nodes are owned by like one company, or they're powered by one company. There's a lot of like, entanglements. Also, I pulled the number $500,000 out of my asshole. It's probably more than that, to be honest. Also, I just want to say, you said on-chain fees may be expensive. On-chain fees are incredibly cheap in Bitcoin right now, and have been for over a year at least. Right now,
it spiked a little bit when the price was going down, but it was like 15 V-bytes per second or 20 V-bytes per second. So like that, and that was like high priority.
That's still low as fuck. Like there was a period where it was like 100 V-bytes, per or 100 sats per VByte. Right now, looking at mempool.space, we've got you could send hundreds of millions of dollars over the Bitcoin network in a transaction, and it would cost you 21 cents. End of story, full stop, final settlement, 21 cents. Whether it's
and it'll clear next block most likely. With
yeah, exactly. Whether it's $1 billion or $5. That's incredible. Great point, Q. Fuck Solana.
Do we feel like we shat on Solana enough?
I think so.
Okay, moving on. Where was it? Oh, I just had it. Oh, to continue the dunks. Former head of product at OpenSea indicted after insider trading scandal. This is a developing story, but it turns out, I guess the DOJ thinks that you can insider trade on NFTs. Get rocked, you fucking scam artists. You know, I think this is going to be very interesting. This reminds me less of insider trading issues and more of, I don't know how familiar either of you guys are. I'm sure Chris is more than P, because P's a nerd who doesn't play sports and was always picked last in PE class. DraftKings went through a similar issue a couple years ago. Where like their employees were using the data that they had of like which players were getting picked for matchups, and then they were finding underpicked players to then like make their teams like that much better, and then boom, like a lot of DraftKings employees or insiders were winning on Sundays, and then it became a whole scandal and debacle. Here's the truth: NFTs are not a regulated anything. Like, they're just not. The DOJ doing this is an interesting step to potentially make NFTs, crypto, shitcoins, some sort of a security under their purview or jurisdiction. But I kind of see this just kind of playing out unless something changes on the legislative level of, hey, these are securities. You were trading securities on insider information. And like, fuck it. I would love it if they make an example out of NFT scammers.
Well, I think it's important to be clear here. We're talking specifically about OpenSea, which is an NFT platform marketplace on top of Ethereum. And this actually came out a while ago, and it sounds like the new news is that the DOJ is actually like investigating / persecuting or prosecuting. But yeah, I mean, if this is the same thing that broke, a number of months back, essentially, the issue is that OpenSea has been presenting this as a free marketplace, and what has actually been happening is specific people who, the way NFTs on OpenSea work is like, nobody gives a shit about the artwork. That's not what any of this is about, right? And now it doesn't need to be, right? Because an NFT is ultimately just a timestamp and a hash. And basically the thing that's interesting is what you kind of link to that timestamp and that hash. Now, well, I won't go on a whole NFT tirade, but there are much more robust ways of implementing non-fungible tokens. Counterparty is one that was built on top of Bitcoin. Not a lot of people know this, but the first NFTs were on Bitcoin. And essentially what these people were doing on OpenSea, again, if it's the same story that I'm thinking of from like 6 months back, is they were just, as you said, they had insider information. They knew, by the way, can you guys hear those little boop, 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 boop on my computer? No. Excellent. Mix minus in full effect. Good. You can't hear the sound effects. I'm getting tons of messages. Anyway, the point is, because I'm a popular guy and I got picked first in dodgeball, but I fucking suck at basketball, which is, I'm short. I'm only 5'8". Anyway, the point is, what they were doing is basically they knew which projects were going to be popular, because like Gary V Friends, which is just like literally Gary V was like, yo, I'm going to draw some shitty drawings and they're going to be worth millions. He literally just printed tens of millions of dollars. And they know when things are going to drop. They control when things are going to drop. They also control the platforms that they own, and control the platforms that like people use to determine whether things are rare or not. So they can artificially tweak those systems and basically drive up their own bags. And so what they were doing, again, this may actually be separate from the thing you were talking about, but what they were doing, what the allegations were, that they were basically just buying the NFTs that they knew were going to be huge, or even worse, they were buying the NFTs, which then they chose to make huge by changing the algorithms, which then ranked whether or not they were rare. And they basically just were like, again, just printing money at the expense of the people who are participating in the platform. So the issue here is it was presented as this is a free market and it's decentralized. And of course, none of it was. And they were just fucking everybody over, and they continue to.
Yeah, and that's dangerous, because you could do that on any day. You could be like, oh, this day, this day, this is the popular one. This day, this is the popular one. You can change it by week, month, however. I know that Michael Saylor talks about this, and he does a pretty good description of it. Like, let's just say the three of us wanted to create an NFT and basically like I create one, I'm going to list it for $1. And then Q gives me $100 for it. And then, P buys it from Q for $1,000. And then, I buy it from him for $10,000. And at the end, when the last sucker buys it, as it sees like the price of it cranking up, whoever sells it, we can split the profits among the three of us. Or even if you have a rich parent, a rich family member, they could just buy it and then dump it on someone else, but no money actually change hands. You know what I mean? Like if my dad transfers me money in my bank account and then I give it back to him, did really money leave our bank accounts? You know what I mean? As a collaborative group. So yeah, you can just get into really just fraudulent practices by doing that.
And to be clear, those fraudulent practices exist in many markets. They exist in the normal art market, which is like they're all over the place. Well, and in NFTs, it just becomes easier. And again, it's because that marketplace is currently unregulated. Now, I'm a huge fan of like no regulation. I think that these should actually be open markets. And I think the people who are lying about what types of markets they are should be held accountable for doing such things. So I think that like, yes, I think these people should get fucked because they're screwing up people over. But at the same time, it's like, if it's an actual free market and people understand that, and there's not misinformation in the advertising, then like, you got to take radical personal responsibility for your decisions and your finances. But yeah, also I want to be, it gets even worse than that actually, Chris. What is very common in the NFT space is actually like creating multiple accounts for a single individual and then buying the NFT back and forth. Like, so you're basically like, you don't even need your uncle. You literally just create another anonymous account. And then basically like you just drive up the price of your own asset. Anyway, enough about NFTs. Well, should we shift to something else?
I just wanted to point out something, because you took the point away from me for the second time now, P, so you're going to be muted for the next 5 minutes. I saw this circulate on Twitter once, and like this was sort of the nail in the coffin for me to like even go down the rabbit hole of NFTs, where someone was kind of explaining like, oh, I drew a bunch of NFTs and then I just bid on my own NFTs. And then now the bid looks like it's a 1,000 ETH project, but like I'm the only bids and someone else just bought it. And then boom, like I made all this money, like blah, blah, blah. And literally I was like, okay, so you just scammed this poor person out of money, thinking that like you created something that a bunch of people are bidding on, when in fact it was you bidding on it. There are a lot of different ways money laundering happens in the fine art world, ranging from just like outright buying an expensive piece of art and then immediately selling it to launder said money, or even commissioning someone to like create a piece of art and then going around and like buying said piece of art to launder your money through this person. The thing that I will only legitimize Ethereum on the assumption that it's also a public blockchain, but at least with like NFTs on Bitcoin, for example, you see the transaction history and it becomes a lot more transparent, at least to the degree where, no, you're not going to see if someone created 1,000 different UTXOs and was upbidding their own NFT project on Bitcoin. Like, unfortunately, you're probably not going to be able to discern that. But it's fascinating because by introducing the money into this public forum, like a blockchain essentially, and the process in which the money has transferred hands, you're going to have a lot harder time laundering money through an NFT project versus in the fine art world. And I only say this in the way I said it because I want to further remind everyone and hammer this point home, and like feel free to like change this story when you say it to your normie friends. But like this is the perfect example of why the FUD around like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies being used for illicit activities is fucking bullshit. Because the like I can't see a US dollar get transferred around. I just can't. Like you're not going to see how much money I gave my drug dealer to buy whatever drugs I just bought. Like that's how it works. But if I were to pay for pot in Bitcoin, you would know.
Well,
if I were
on
to
chain.
go,
But yeah, I mean, sorry, your point is correct.
but like
your point stands,
understand.
yes.
The point I'm trying to make is like if my drug dealer could only accept Bitcoin, like yes, there are ways around it, but like it's in a public forum, unlike any other monetary transaction in the history of monetary transactions. And for that reason, the bullshit around Bitcoin is used for illicit activities is complete and utter bullshit.
Well, no, I mean, I think you're correct. You're correct.
Everything does get used to like, there's a spectrum of uses, and there are people who use it for honorable and admirable things, people who are building it out. And then there's fucking assholes who use it for shady, illegal practices or sketchy things. Like,
but I think
everything.
Yeah, exactly. That is the correct statement. And I think like, people think, to your point though, you're absolutely correct. A blockchain is a terrible thing. A public ledger is a terrible thing to use if you're trying to like be super secretive. Now, one of the things that's really important, right? There are certain, projects where they have prioritized, private transactions. That's not Bitcoin. Bitcoin, the most important thing is one of the most important things is the fixed monetary supply, 21 million Bitcoin, public ledger. Now, there are a lot of systems. Now, privacy in transactions is important, especially if you're trying to, transact in Bitcoin, in political regimes where, the government is trying to actively and very deliberately fuck you over. And so there are ways of doing that, but Bitcoin is pseudo-anonymous. It is not anonymous. And that's an important distinction. And there are things like coin joins, which increase that anonymity, increase your anonymity set. And that's important, but you're absolutely right. I think the thing you said at the end is really the key point. It's like people use things for good things and people use things for bad things. Cars are insane when you think about it on the face of it. A vehicle that is like several tons that can drive at like 100 miles an hour, like nobody even considers the idea that like, should we ban cars because people can drive them through crowds? Like, no, that's not even on the table. Like it's people can use things for good or bad, and the people should be held accountable for those actions, not like the systems that are used. A steak knife, you can use a steak knife to cut steak and to cut food, or you can use it to stab somebody, but nobody's like, we should ban steak knives. And it's just ridiculous. I'll leave it at that. What's next? What other stories we got?
I got
one. Muted, Q.
I got one if you
Chris,
want.
is yours the story that Sean just posted in the news channel?
No.
I want to do this one really quickly, and then we'll do yours, because this is breaking news right now. But there is a bill being introduced by Congress to essentially have all congressional members and their family disclose what cryptocurrencies they hold. While this seems minimal, like, is this going to stop anyone from doing anything? Like, I think Nancy Pelosi's husband has proven it through a lot and extensive career that no, literally nothing is going to stop just because the government has to like disclose what they hold. So it's curious though that they're doing this, because I think this is going to be a precursor to some sort of legislation around cryptocurrencies at large. And my fear is that Bitcoin gets clumped in as a security. All we can do, unfortunately, is hope people like Cynthia Loomis and, god damn it, I cannot fucking believe I'm going to say it, Ted Cruz are the hopes for Bitcoin's future. God damn it, it hurts. I don't know though. I think this is the important takeaway here is the fact that the government itself wants to start keeping an eye on it, even if it's just like amongst themselves. Like, this is how it starts. This is how it starts before they eventually introduce legislation that's like, oh, we need to know everyone's cryptocurrency holdings. Oh, we need to know like just what you hold. Oh, we need to tax you a little bit for what you hold. Oh, we need some of it that you hold. Oh, you shouldn't hold it. We should hold it for you. On slippery slope. Hyperbole? I don't know. Thoughts?
I don't know enough to like opine intelligently on this topic, but what I will say is I don't think that the government should be regulating even things like OpenSea. I think my belief is that basically everyone should be held accountable as individuals for it being like, oh, you got fucked over. It's because you didn't know what you were doing and you got to take responsibility for it. I hate the narrative that like, or the idea that like it's the government's responsibility to keep everyone safe. Like in this way, like obviously there are certain categories of things that yes, you want the government to step in and regulate. Food safety is an example, but or could be an example. That there's probably reasons why that's a terrible thing too. I mean, certainly like the organic bullshit. Anyway, there's always bullshit around somewhere. I don't think that politicians should be required to divulge their assets. I don't think that will. I suspect that will get taken advantage of and will just create the illusion of transparency rather than actual transparency. That's my gut, but I will admit I do not know enough about the story, nor have I researched it enough to like form a real opinion here. So I could be totally wrong. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a slippery slope. Yeah, I don't know if it's. I guess it's one thing. Don't they have to disclose already like any assets they hold in terms of stocks and bonds?
30 days. You have 30 days to announce that you have purchased or sold a security. That is the law. So if things like cryptocurrencies become securities in the eyes of the law, then it would just automatically, you would have to be disclosing these type of things.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's less. I'm not so much worried about the transactions. Like I actually am kind of okay with the idea that for the time being, like the on and off ramps, especially with like KYC stuff, like they're just gonna know. There's gonna have to be a solution for that in the future. My solution is genuinely like get the government out of the money and solutions will find their way out. I do think it's important though to really emphasize the idea that this is not about transacting the cryptocurrency. This is about having an eye on what you hold. So everyone who is a long-term Bitcoin holder who has no intention of selling, that is the class of people right now that should be paying close attention to this legislation, because that will have a more direct impact on your day-to-day life than those who transact, who are spending their Bitcoin on a regular basis, those who are like Michael Saylor and MicroStrategy are sweating over this because of what it can possibly lead to. This is pure speculation, but like if I am in that position, I am concerned that my giant mountain of Bitcoin will not only is it like publicly known that I hold this, but now the government is trying to make attempts to make it more okay to know on a personal level what you hold, which only leads to one thing in my mind, and that will inevitably be taxes. So that is where the concern for me comes from. But obviously, like this is truly a developing story. I read the article like live while we had Adam O on, so something to keep an eye on for my fellow diamond hand hodlers.
Yeah, I got one more story, and then we got a couple minutes till we got Bitcoin Magazine Pro. So the last one, this is from James Bullard. He is the chairman of the St. Louis Fed. So he said sometime last year in quote tweet, Fed could reduce policy rate in late 2023 or 2024. And then a couple months later or earlier of this year, he said make that late 2022 or early 2023. And then now he said today, 3.5% for Fed funds rate is going to be a good minimum for how high policy rates need to go. So, complete capitulation of saying reducing balance sheet of the Federal Reserve to, changing, like basically keeping it at 0% interest rates to now it needs to be 3.5%, which is, a complete reversal of what he was saying, not even, or a little over a year ago. What are your thoughts there, guys?
I'm gonna let you go first, Q.
I mean, classic moving the goalpost. I'm not like, this to me is almost the same as Janet Yellen being like, oh, yeah, I was wrong about inflation. So what? What are you going to do about it? Fire me? Like, same energy to me. There's no responsibility, but where's the synonym for responsibility that I'm trying to think of? It's on the tip of my tongue.
Not drowning puppies. I think that's what you meant to say?
No.
I'm just sitting here in silence while you think about it. Yeah. I mean, look,
I really just Googled responsibility synonyms because I'm so stuck right now.
Yeah. While you continue relearning how the thesaurus works and stuff. Yeah, there you go. Man, I'll be honest, I feel like so much of this stuff.
Accountability. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there never was, or there almost never is any in these types of situations. I honestly think of the majority of the news around this is just like straight up noise. And I think that the only reason that I am interested in trying to force myself to like care about it is because it has an effect on the behavior of other people. But the specific things that are said and the actions and the actions that are taken, it's all just noise. Like, or rather the discrepancy between the two of those things is just noise. Like, they're going to say, the Fed has been trying to telegraph its actions for however many decades now. Like, they say things to try to move the markets in a specific way, and then they do very different things. That's very common. They try to telegraph their actions. They see how things are going to respond, and then they change their approach. The idea that the Fed controls inflation, or that the Fed controls anything, is a useful and embarrassing fiction that I think fewer and fewer people actually subscribe to. The reality is the Fed is a reactionary body, and they know that. They know that. And so they say things, they hope for the best, and then they they go flip 180 degrees or change their behaviors or the things that they're saying based on what actually happens in the market. So they're not a leading indicator. They're a lagging indicator.
Fuck the Fed. You're right. They're not necessarily the root cause of inflation, but they're not helping.
No. Sorry. Let me be clear. They printed more money, like in the last, whatever it was, since 2008, something like 80%. Well, there's a lot of.
No, dude. The 80% number is since 2020. That's
no, it's not. No. It's 2008. There's it's 70%, I think, or 60% since 2020. I don't know what the actual figures are, but there's a lot of how you calculate that number, like M1, M2, M3. It's all kind of mushy. The point is, a fuck ton of money has been printed, and that directly affects inflation. I'm not saying those actions have profound and generational consequences, and the Fed has. But again, we would probably do the same thing if we were in their shoes. Separate from that, though, when we talk about
put that on me. Don't you put that on me, Ricky Bobby. You may be a degenerate who would print money endlessly. I would not.
Fair enough. My point is the idea that by changing the rates, the Fed can magically shift the trajectory. That is a fallacy. They are primarily a reactionary body that takes action through telegraphing things to the market. That's my personal belief. They're like the TSA, right? The TSA doesn't catch anyone. They basically something happens and they're like, now we're banning shoes. That's the Fed basically. They don't do anything proactive. They attempt to say they're doing things proactively to shift markets in the ways that they believe that they should be shifted. On that note, I'm gonna hand it back to you.
Let's take a commercial break because we are joined by none other than Sam Roll. So very quick commercial break, and we're gonna dive into some of this. I see Sam is very excited to talk to us as always. So we'll dive into all this, but yeah, I mean, fuck the Fed. Buy some Bitcoin. You know the drill. Stick around. What is up, everyone on YouTube? We are back. For everyone who is watching on YouTube, we are hosting Twitter Spaces. For everyone who is on Twitter Spaces, feel free to pop over. We will populate at the very top a link so you can join us over on YouTube. We'll be pulling up some charts. We'll be talking to none other than Sam Rule from the Bitcoin Magazine Pro team. And I first wanted, before we dive in, just make sure everyone knows the Bitcoin Magazine Pro exists. It is a free newsletter that Dylan Leclerc and Sam Rule put together on a weekly basis, correct? There's more content than just a week.
Yeah,
right?
no, I can give some context on it. We do daily and weekly basis. It's a free and paid newsletter, research analysis on Bitcoin markets, anything related to on-chain, derivatives, equities, macro, kind of a mix of anything that can move or explain the Bitcoin market that Dylan and I are researching. So we have free tier. If you're interested, we're trying to push out a lot more free content over the next few months. Usually we do 1 or 2 issues a week. And then for paid tier, try to do about 4 or 5 issues a week and some other benefits. So I got a link in my Twitter bio if anyone's interested in checking it out. They haven't already.
We're going to pin some stuff up to the top, but also be sure, guys, we're going to be going over some charts in a moment. So be sure to join us over on the YouTube stream as well, so you can actually see these charts in action. We've pinned a link so you can actually, yeah, okay. Chris, I'm going to let you handle pinning what needs to be pinned so that I can actually have this conversation. Sam, I'd love to start things off with the Fed. That's where the conversation just ended with P, myself, and Chris. We hear Janet Yellen coming out and saying, hey, I was wrong. We heard Biden sit down with Powell and Yellen for probably like 3 days. And of the 3 days that they sat, there was about 3 minutes that they could share of worthy content. Curious where your head is at from the latest rumblings out of the Fed. We're 2 weeks out from the next FOMC meeting with expectations at a 50 basis point hike. Last thing I saw was that it's almost at 0% the likelihood for a 75 basis point hike. So just initially, what are your thoughts with what's going on as far as the Fed goes and everything else?
Sure. Yeah. And it'd be good to hear maybe a little collective summary of what you guys were talking about before. But the way I see it is kind of over the last few months, like just from a macro perspective framework, is that the Fed is now, as we saw with like Janet Yellen and has been for some time, kind of owning up to the inflation is transitory type narrative and saying, hey, we made a huge mistake, got it wrong, kind of oversubscribed a lot of liquidity in the system from both a kind of fiscal and monetary policy perspective back in COVID. Didn't slam kind of the brakes earlier that they probably needed to. And now you get in a kind of a tough place where the only thing they can afford to do politically is kind of like curb inflation as much as possible. So I think that's where all of a sudden, the Fed shifts from, okay, hey, we're on both sides of markets here. We can kind of go back and forth to over like the short 3 to 6 month medium term of saying, well, we're so wrong about inflation, and that, maybe there's some embarrassment there from like a decision-making perspective. And politically, it's, one of the worst things to have for population to be going under inflation over, just the minimum of what CPI 8% is, that really like they're left with no choice but to print these 50 basis point hikes. So, and I think at this point too, and like in a total unstable, volatile macro environment, the last thing you want to do is be switching back and forth from this policy. So how I see it, and I know a lot in the past, it's been like, okay, Fed jawboning, they're saying they're going to raise rates, they're managing markets, they're doing like that. I think in this case, going to see a series of 50 basis point hikes through the next few meetings. I think that's pretty expected in markets now and pricing. And then you get to essentially maybe like a Fed funds rate, over something of 2% or around there, and then start to talk about, okay, is there kind of see what happens in terms of that rate hike, and also the kind of tightening that's happening now. So now we're not doing tapering, but kind of treasury runoffs from the balance sheet is starting to go forth a little bit too. So after you're essentially going to see like a few months of that time, and then the Fed try to reassess like how much damage is essentially coming from that. But I think my framework is that in terms of like the inflation has to be the number one priority over essentially what they say their mandate is, and the job market as well, and unemployment. And they're going to do whatever is necessary to rate hikes and try to just curb demand as much as possible. Obviously, they said now that there's nothing they can do about supply chain issues, and they don't have that power, and certainly don't. But they can try to curb demand and push it as down as possible, which then you run in the risk of essentially getting into recession territory. Signs aren't necessarily showing that already. So maybe that is like the general path, or like the general framework that I think of, is that like these rate hikes are coming. I'm not sure how they can curb inflation back to essentially their median 2% target without kind of forcing an inflation or a recession. And so now I think there's just going to be like some stability over the next few months in terms of the 50 basis point hikes that they want to put out.
We hear a lot about the various causes for inflation. I'm starting to I mean, I never believed anything the government said. I definitely equated a lot of it to the money printing itself. But I wonder how much of it, in your opinion, is rooted around like the stimulus and the money that we are inherently spending, and how much higher can prices really go before the government steps in and does something absolutely crazy, like set price locks on certain goods or services? And I know I'm having a very speculative conversation with you.
Yeah, no, sure. Totally. I guess how I see like from the inflation narrative, at least in the inflation that we look at today, in terms of like the price inflation and how it's measured in the CPI and things we're buying. And that's different from obviously asset price inflation that QE's likely had an effect on over the last decade. But it's really, I think, the combination of both the monetary and fiscal kind of injection that we had during 2020 in COVID that is really doing all of this, right? Injecting those trillions of dollars into a place, giving it to consumer demand, while supply chain was unfolding anyway, issues in supply chain there. So I think it's largely that it's hard to, when you think of like, okay, QE making its way into kind of the bank reserves, but not necessarily that making it into the real economy. I think there's certainly tons of research and study to point to, okay, well, that has made its way possibly into asset markets and equity valuations over the last decade. But I think really in the prices that, you and I are buying today in terms of food, rent, all those things, is like largely that kind of fiscal monetary policy stimulus combination, kind of debt monetization that we had in 2020. And there's a lot of good like Fed research academic papers of saying like that essentially like this was the next step because of the lack of inflation that, in terms of like the CPI, that QE has spawned over the last decade of trying to spur that. So really in terms of crisis territory, it was how do we do both these in combination? And that's kind of a new tool that we haven't really seen in a kind of an experiment at large. So that's kind of how I see largely what's driving that. And then obviously on the supply side, it's just making things worse. I think you could easily make the case too that, from like a monetary unit perspective, like fiat currency that we have, that's been very misconstrued. So price signals over time get worse and compounded. It's harder to measure. And then I guess in terms of like where prices are and how much higher they can go, I don't necessarily have like this high target of saying, and be curious if you have any thoughts on like, hey, this is where I think inflation or where prices are going to go next. If anything, what I start to see in the data is that like inflation looks like it's elevated and here to stay. But it is reaching a little bit of a turning point, at least in the data that's measured by the United States. And that it's going through like a potential peak right now. And so not to say that like everything is going to come down to like 2% inflation or 3% inflation, everything's likely going to remain elevated until we start to see how well QT does at curbing some of this demand and have like this demand destruction. But I'm not so certain that like on a CPI, like an acceleration basis, that, you know, we're going to see like 10, 15% type inflation in the United States.
I think I'm just too bearish. I like one thing that I keep paying attention to and that genuinely worries me is the fact that the price for a barrel of oil still hasn't hit the all-time high from 2007, 2008, nor has it even come up on, I have a chart pulled up, on the highs it reached back in 1980. So like there's still a lot more runway to go. And one thing that it's interesting how it flip-flopped. You saw 2 weeks ago, companies like Target and Walmart released earnings reports that shattered the entire consumer discretionary market. You saw every single company in that space sell off. And then this past week, I believe it was, Dollar Tree starts actually saying that we actually had good numbers. And the only justification in my head that I have as to why a company like Target and Walmart struggled, but a company like Dollar Tree was successful is you're catering to, yes, a lower demographic to begin with. So you can't go anywhere else to start. You're probably bringing in customers from Walmart and Target into your shop. But Walmart and Target have been trying to compete with Amazon. They've been trying to do a lot of shipping. They've been trying to expand. And as the price of oil and gas goes up, both Target and Walmart actually cited that they haven't felt or necessarily passed on, I'm paraphrasing here, the rising cost of oil for their operations has not been felt by their consumers yet. So you have that impending rise in just general cost of goods that's looming for the average American, on top of the fact that we are depleting our oil supplies and reserves. It all starts and ends with oil, in my opinion. And that's where I think what is most likely is someone from the government starting to throw out the idea of let's cap the price of gas. And that will be a very, very dangerous and very scary thing, because you will piss off the biggest cartel in the world that is already pissed that 2 years ago the world laughed and mocked that we let the price of oil get negative, and they never want that to happen again. And if they buy into the narrative that like we're going to be a fully green ecosystem, which like we're so far away from that, it's laughable. But there's a little bit of fear that like if that becomes a possibility, like all these oil rich countries are going to be depleted of the amount of wealth and the status that they have, so they might as well cash in on this last go around. That's just my 2 cents on it, but we're not here to listen to me. We're here to listen to you.
No, that's totally fair. And I think obviously energy prices makes it a totally different conversation, how long that's going to take and what it's doing now to prices of goods and production costs around the world. And I guess on the end of it too, it's really like how hot can inflation run? How high can prices get before, essentially from like a consumer sentiment perspective, that growth and purchases and things that can be had can still continue and kind of essentially maintain that inflation as well. So you mentioned Target, Walmart. I mean, basically any large company that you're taking now across tech as well, all big earning misses across the board, essentially seeing like more and more kind of growth slowdown estimates coming out. And so, you know, on the flip side of that, after like you have these inflationary periods and what we're going through now, essentially, you know, the solution to rising prices is that essentially kills demand. And so then you get these, you know, deflationary events that can play out after. So I think that's the other side of things when you start thinking about like recession territory and also just like a lower growth and a weakening consumer from like an inflation adjusted sales standpoint, from an increase in like a massive increase in terms of the revolving credit that consumers are facing today, low personal savings rates, essentially like how high can those inflation prices be sustained by the everyday individual. So it's a good point. It's hard to tell sometimes in the market, like regimes like to think of it in kind of this grid quadrant style framework. This is the old like Ray Dalio framework. And there's a lot of good macro research shops that use this. But essentially, you know, are we in more of a stagflationary environment where inflation is constantly accelerating, ticking up month over month in low growth? And are we then, does that then lead to more of a deflation environment where inflation is still accelerated, potentially peaked, but like growth is turning down with it? So you don't really have growth to help, you know, maintain some of those higher prices for long as well.
I want to pop over to slide number 3, because you were incredible, awesome, and essentially put together a chart where, again, reminder for everyone on Twitter Spaces, we are over on YouTube, and you can see the chart that we are looking about and about to discuss. But you've essentially shown the Bitcoin price action from November of 2021, in addition to some select major tech stocks from Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Tesla and Netflix. And look, the first thing a smooth brain person like me looks at and sees is, wow, Bitcoin was the second worst asset in this group. I'm curious, like, Netflix aside, because I think Netflix becomes a weird little outlier in this conversation. I see something like this and I'm like, oh, the volatility on Bitcoin is greater than the volatility on all other tech stocks. Volatility is not always a negative drawdown, and you didn't really see Bitcoin, like, it doesn't really look to me like Bitcoin did anything drastic. A lot of these stocks had moments where an earnings report came out and they had to sell off sharply and hard. Bitcoin was a very steady decline, it looks like. Sam, share with us sort of what your takeaways are staring at this chart and what you're seeing or noticing.
Yeah, for sure. So I think in one particular, I think it's interesting from perspective of like, as all of these things turn down, the entire equity market, I mean, not just staying here, but I think it's easy to say with how Bitcoin trades in terms of its correlations, and we've covered it like many times, whether it's the NASDAQ or IVG is another related tech indices stock, or just the FANG itself here, that Bitcoin is traded a lot like these, and continues to do so. I think that is just the nature of where it's at today, its final financialization process. And so in one way, you're saying, okay, Bitcoin is just tech, or it's just trading that way. I think in the other side of it is saying, okay, everything is in this almost one-to-one correlated market now as well. And so even these larger names that we're seeing, it's very rare that you're going to see 30, 40, 50% drawdowns in these bigger tech stocks, talking the ones that are some of the most successful companies in the world. But you have Bitcoin kind of competing in par with that. And so for people that have been around like a Bitcoin cycle, seen 80% drawdowns, the volatility, the cyclical nature of it, like multiple times, I think if you're new to Bitcoin or newer investors, you're getting into it, of course, like 53% like down drawdown is going to shake you. But I mean, essentially now that's happening everywhere in the market. So I would actually say, like, if you've been in Bitcoin for a while, or if you're holding a decent position in there, and you've gone through a drawdown like this before, or at least you understand that it can do this, that's pretty kind of normal and understood. And I think people get used to that kind of conviction and risk, but not so much here in terms of equity. So I would say in terms of performance for the rest of the market, I'm not necessarily saying like that this is a bottom or like this is where we are from drawdown. I actually probably more on the bear side of things, that things are actually going to get worse for in just terms of like equity return performance and Bitcoin overall. But I think it is promising to look at this and say it's holding up pretty strong relative to what the rest of kind of major equity market is, where most of the money allocated in equities is. And so I think that's a pretty impressive thing to just say Bitcoin's 13 years old. It's always seen as this speculation, this liquidity. But when you compare it from all-time high drawdowns in terms of returns, that it's not too far off from the major stocks we're seeing.
I'm curious, in all of these sort of tech stocks that we're talking about or looking at, these are the mega caps more or less. I'm curious if any of these to you look interesting, or if Bitcoin itself just continues to be sort of that through line for you. And yes, I know the answer to this question already.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So when I think about like, I guess you're thinking of are like talking about allocating to some of these first Bitcoin, essentially like prospects. Yeah. So for me, I probably don't look into like individual equities as much as mostly focused on Bitcoin. And I think the rationale and the reasoning for that is, I mean, you're looking at $1 trillion asset. In my head, the total addressable market, TAM is a cliche word at this point, but like is orders of magnitude higher than that, 100x higher than that over time. In my head, for what a decentralized money kind of store value, medium of exchange, multiple use cases for what Bitcoin can be. So how I think of like the macro cycle is essentially like, what is the upside or the drawdown period that you would want to put money into something for a 5-10 year time horizon. I'm sure people could model out Amazon's growth or Google's, Microsoft's returns better than me, and what that can mean for your upside over the next decade. I also think it's different too. I mean, some of these things are some of the like best performing businesses in the world, and they have a much lower potential maybe growth profile at the stage that they are now than something like Bitcoin does. So I think Bitcoin is really, you're saying it's $1 trillion asset. You're saying it's a market, could be well over 100 trillion kind of in the long run of things. You're taking that bet. So just from an asymmetric upside bet of like where it is today, I think it's a different discussion. Also, I think it's a different discussion of whether like wealth preservation or like you're trying to grow into, take a bet on what you think is going to be like a completely different future of the world. So I guess I think of them in different ways. And I think that would go to the point too, that the market doesn't necessarily think of them in different ways right now. Obviously it trades like tech, it follows that. I mean, that's where most institutions' financialization is happening. And so maybe then, that could lead into, if we want to talk about some like potential decoupling periods in Bitcoin's future. I mean, for me, it's just that Bitcoin takes a lot of education and research to understand its place in the world. And then you got to be convinced by that thesis and argument as well too. It's kind of been a hotbed for speculation and liquidity. It's speculative by nature. So I think it's an education piece too, that I think we're just starting to see play out. Like, it might take, a couple, 2 or 3 more years until you see a lot more sophistication and grasping of what Bitcoin can become.
Chris, can you pop us over to slide number 2? Because I think this is a really interesting one to point out. Like, I've been pounding the drum so obnoxiously about the correlation. However, this chart, while it does send a signal that like, oh, when the NASDAQ was going up, so was Bitcoin on this log scale. But the correlation really tightened over the course of, I would say, like from November to roughly now, where you see it trading almost in lockstep in certain occasions. Like, we don't need to speculate on what's causing this. There are 100 different theses. The right answer is because big funds are treating this as a risk on asset. There's no other right answer to that. But I'm curious, Sam, if there is, like, looking at this chart, what are your takeaways? What are you paying attention to? And what would be the first sign on looking at a chart like this that Bitcoin has started its decoupling process from the NASDAQ?
Definitely. So I think biggest takeaway, like when you look at a chart like this or any chart of the market right now since November, and there's been like a big shift of focus in our research and trying to talk about, is like everything is as close to being one trade right now as possible. And that affects Bitcoin, that affects equities, that affects the NASDAQ. And we're kind of still in that type of regime. And that's going to be based on kind of the market regimes that we're in today, where growth is headed, where inflation is headed, where the credit market is headed, just the level of volatility right now, kind of in this rush to cash and this repositioning, and people, as we progress through what looks to be kind of like an extended bear market that we're in, it's just kind of how things are going to go. And we study a lot in terms of, when Dylan and I, we go through a lot of the on-chain metrics and look at the economic behavior on there. But really, at the end of the day, when you have a $1 trillion asset class and pools of hundreds and hundreds of trillions in a major market move that we're going through today, I mean, really all you have to do is pull up one of these charts. You can pull up the VIX volatility index for the S&P. It's same with the dollar index as well, or related to a basket of currencies. And as those things go up, Bitcoin goes down. And that's just kind of how it has been. Same with equities as well. And so I see it as like that essentially we're going to need some higher volatility move event, some higher breaking of something, some major kind of move, whether that's a dovish pivot and like a liquidity injection at a large scale that like we've never seen before. Maybe that's something in the credit markets becoming a lot more insolvent, potentially impacts on like emerging markets credits, or like credit spreads blowing out. So the spread between a lot of the corporate junk bonds that we see today, between the treasury bills that we have. And so that's kind of the thesis that we've been working through for a while, is that it seems now in this like volatility uncertainty event that everything is just like a little bit on pause as people reposition, try to think about inflation deflation dynamics. And so I guess what I'm looking for from like a Bitcoin standpoint is that when we do have this bottoming out, is how I see it, at least. And, that's what make markets and market opinions, is that some people might think we've already made that bottom. I think the worst is yet to come, is that Bitcoin surprises people that it doesn't really go tank below, just throw a price out here, 20,000 or something, and sustain below there. Then it has a quick bounce, and then the people see the demand flowing back into it. And it's not just about like a reflating of liquidity demand, but it's just the demand that's been happening for Bitcoin for a while. So I think the biggest critique, like macro critique, that I see quite a bit is, and I think it can be fair based on some analysis, people haven't studied Bitcoin as much, or they study it and they don't think it's the right thing for the future, is essentially they say it's just all like a liquidity lottery trade at this point. And so I think that would prove a lot of people wrong, to have like a pretty strong short Bitcoin bottom that shows a lot of demand and interest and adoption in it, and that it's not just going to like slowly grind down and disappear over the next year.
I'm curious, and this again, just we're talking to friends and a lot of people are eavesdropping. Like the last time Bitcoin had its bull run, breaking out above its previous all-time high. Actually, no, that's not true, because it made an all-time high, contracted, then made a new all-time high just shortly above it. But I want to talk about like the 2020 bull run, where we saw early on, you had that cataclysmic event where COVID happens, lockdowns happens, everything, stock market, Bitcoin, crypto markets, everything crashed for a moment. And then you started to have a quick, speedy recovery. You have interest rates get crashed down to zero, and you have stimulus just get injected into people's wallets, into different businesses, into the stock market. I'm curious which of these two sides of the coin, increasing government spending or decreasing of interest rates, you think is going to be most helpful for Bitcoin's, like from a price perspective, growth?
I think it would probably be a increase in more fiscal stimulus, is how I would try to think of it. I mean, that's really that at least would make the proposition for Bitcoin a lot more apparent in terms of like the monetary inflation supply. I think the difficult, when you say like, okay, interest rates are dropping, people are going to essentially safe haven in treasuries. That's more of maybe a market shift, but it also keeps capital cheap for people to reinvest in those assets as well. But I think the fiscal stimulus showed maybe a direct link to, hey, here is this monetary printing that is affecting prices for all of us, and make the use case more apparent for what Bitcoin is really about in terms of this tool or this money that doesn't have this debasement, essentially, that can happen in the play out. So maybe because it's more apparent. Now, from a market impact perspective, obviously we've seen what low interest rates and QE have done for assets and equities over the last 10 years. Potentially we go through another wave of that. But maybe from like a user consumer adoption perspective, I mean, there's probably no better marketing right now to start sowing the seeds for people than to see kind of a monetary system get out of control in terms of the inflation that we're seeing today. So that's kind of my hunch. I mean, there's not a lot of data, it's more speculation to back that, but I would think that it would make the use case more apparent, because I think a lot of the use case right now in terms of the United States or the Western world for Bitcoin is really just about, and what we've been talking about too, is just about the price, it's about the investment. It's about the growth potential of the next decade. It's not necessarily about wanting to use the monetary network or the money that it is. And I think that goes in waves, but generally my thoughts on that.
I mean, I'd love your thoughts. Like what right now that's getting developed on the network level are you most excited for? Or are you paying closest attention to?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, largely, I think in times like this, what you want to see is like the increase in adoption and adoption for like what is going to be the next stage of Bitcoin. So I just think Lightning as a whole, I think it just hit in terms of like what we know in public capacity, because there's a lot of private capacity on Lightning, is reaching now to I think 4,000 Bitcoin in terms of capacity. So I think, in a large part, a lot of people focus on price, but you try to look for like these adoption pieces to say, okay, what is going to be like the fundamental drivers and the use cases much beyond where it's going. So in general, I'm most excited about Lightning. It's something that like I get to use in like my daily kind of weekly routine, although that is a little bit more fun. But I mean, that is like the use case that I think in a lot of places that's going to bring a lot more people to the network, because it goes beyond just like the investment kind of Bitcoin sitting as like a HODL technology in there. So that's mostly, probably what I'm most excited for.
And just for smooth brain people like me, like adoption on Lightning, to you, does that mean more nodes opening Lightning channels? Does that mean transactions has increased tenfold from what we see today? Like, talk to us. Let's break that down a little bit more.
Yeah, totally. I think there's a lot of ways you could look at it. Nodes is certainly one way. I generally like to think of it as like public capacity, because capacity being like how much essentially demand is needed and flowing through on Lightning. I think nodes is certainly one way. Obviously, you can just increase capacity through nodes, and whether that's necessarily one user doing it or a node using it on the behalf of, or I should say, whether that's like a million people getting on the Lightning or one people using higher capacity on Lightning. I think that's really the most interesting thing, that it can grow. And this is from Bitcoin's perspective too. You could have a huge amount of capital move in and with a smaller amount of people, and that still shows pretty strong adoption. So I look at it both. I look at it in nodes, I look at the public capacity, try to look at the amount of like, I know Arcane's done a good report on this, of trying to say how many companies are essentially rolling out and like enabling Lightning in wallets on there as well. I mean, I think that always the tricky thing in Lightning is it's got a private element to it that you're not going to be able to see the adoption, the data happening. So really looking at like the exponential growth, like year on year over year in terms of like the capacity is interesting. And just the number of like capable services or wallets, like when you think of like Cash App or Kraken integrating it now with accounts. So like potentially the number of accounts that you have out there in the wild that have some connection to Bitcoin that Lightning is a part of. And watching that grow, I think, is maybe the best way to see a kind of adoption coming in.
I love that. Sam, before I corner you into talking to us about price action and these beautiful Bitcoin charts that you took the time to put together, is there anything else you want to talk more on a macro level before we dive into the on-chain stuff?
No, I think that's good. I think a lot of we go through, definitely like revisit some of the macro thesis stuff a decent amount. I would just say from like a price action standpoint, something I'm looking for, a number that I've seen a lot in macro quantitative research, and one that is mostly like a median back test of like where we're going in terms of equities and kind of S&P 500 index in terms of drawdown, is somewhere around like that 30% level, where I think we've reached about 17%. So in my case, from when I look at, we'll get in some of these Bitcoin charts too, which is kind of showing that bearish case. Just from that macro perspective, I think Dylan and I kind of shifted to focusing on how far can this fall over in terms of January. And so still that kind of thesis where we're looking for kind of like a volatility or credit spread blow up. And especially when we're starting to see a lot more in terms of the earnings and the growth fall over, that's kind of like what we have in mind in Bitcoin to follow that. So I'll just leave it at that, but I know we've talked about that quite a bit.
And guys, I cannot emphasize or stress this enough. The content that Sam and Dylan put together for the Bitcoin Magazine Pro newsletter is exceptional. If you are enjoying this conversation, if you want deeper analysis on that stuff, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you go and subscribe. It is a free newsletter. It will be something that you are grateful to be reading on a regular basis. And I mean, you're just dumb if you're not reading it, but I digress. I want to start with slide number 1. Sam, you tweeted out the other day, and this tweet is also pinned at the top for Twitter Spaces, but also feel free to come over and see our pretty faces on YouTube. There was a correction to some of this Glassnode data. Walk us through maybe what you're noticing that's like really instrumental that could make or signal a significant change in some theses, if that's the right plural for thesis. Or like, was the correction just like, oh, they had a couple of numbers wrong, but ultimately like things are still sort of where we were at with the bad data or the incorrect data, sorry.
Yeah, totally. No, maybe I'll start with a little bit of like a TLDR with kind of like what happened. So the chart we're showing here is Bitcoin's realized price, which is kind of the average cost basis of the network. So essentially with the UTXO set, we can see every Bitcoin that's moved and essentially what price it bought it at, or a market participant bought it at. So if you have one coin that's was $1,000 and bought, and you have another coin that's one coin that's $20,000, you get a realized price of $10,000 in between. So it gives a rough cost basis of the network, and it's kind of it's a really elegant way to like view Bitcoin's price monetization over time, because it kind of acts as this floor price. Is like you have a lot of speculation in the price between these boom and bust cycles and derivatives blowing up and changing that. But in terms of like the realized price, it's pretty consistent and shows, this logarithmic growth that's pretty stable over Bitcoin's lifetime, especially through halving cycles and the boom and bust cycles we've seen before. So that's realized price. And then you can break that down into a couple cohorts on the Bitcoin network, and Glassnode does this. They break down groups into short-term holders and long-term holders. Probably see those a lot. I'll probably walk through some of the basics here just to make sure if anyone new kind of understand those. But you'll see that a lot in terms of just talking about like Bitcoin's on-chain analysis. And what's useful about that is essentially you have you're breaking down 2 different significant cohorts that play into Bitcoin's market dynamics that can tell you a lot about like the behavior on the network. So a little bit about that methodology. Essentially what constitutes a like short-term holder for a long-term holder is there's some good statistical analysis from Glassnode to show that after about 155 days, the people or market participants, an entity is less likely to sell their Bitcoin after holding it for about 5 to 6 months. And so there's a cutoff there to say, okay, as that statistically declines, you can still sell, people still do, it fluctuates. But they're less likely to do when you're long-term holders. So, what this looks at is one, that's a group that hasn't sold in about 155 days in those entities. And so it's not just addresses either or an individual participant. They also do some analysis to look at entities. And then on the other side, you have short-term holders, which are more of like your price speculators, new market entrants, traders, things like that. And so the breakdown in supply of something like that is like long-term holders hold about 71% of supply. So it's not the best way to say, you know, when I hear long-term holder, I'm thinking someone who like holds for 4 years and doesn't move their coins. But it's a way to like cut the cohorts a little bit to kind of dissect them a little bit more. And so the issue essentially they had is like a bug in how they go about some of this methodology in getting some long-term holders or short-term holders in terms of like the supply and the price. And so what a big part of this was, and what this chart doesn't show, is here you have a realized price of $23,700, average cost network of the average cost base of the network. The long-term holder realized price is a little below that. What we're seeing kind of in their bug is like the long-term holder realized price had a huge drawdown. It went down to something of like $7,000-8,000 of where it is today. So incredibly significant. And what that would essentially say, if that was true, is that there's a bit of a capitulation happening with long-term holders of recent buyers, essentially people who bought it 50, 60,000 6 months ago, 5 months ago, were essentially selling those coins in a huge way, which would have been kind of like this unprecedented event that happening on the network. Necessarily that wasn't the case. Long-term holder kind of cost basis has been accumulating quite a bit. And so I think it sent this wrong signal in terms of like the on-chain world, pretty significant in terms of the data that we look at. I don't think it necessarily changed any like short-term market data thesis, but it did paint the picture that like these long-term holders who have been holding coins for a long time, this methodology that Glassnode had, essentially that they're going through this huge capitulation and sell-off event right now in Bitcoin. So making, I guess, making it seem much worse in the data than it actually was. So that's been adjusted now. You know, they fixed that just this week. It's been an issue that's been more pronounced over the last couple months. So it's a little kind of a like short summary of that. Happy to go into maybe more of the details and if we need to, or just more about realized price in general.
Do you want to do the long-term holder realized price and realized price chart on slide 4? We don't need to go super in depth on the Glassnode stuff. I think your explanation I think does it justice. Take a look. We have pinned to the top the thread or the tweet that you actually sent out. I believe it was yesterday, which is at the top of your profile. And just a reminder, if you are on Twitter Spaces, swipe all the way to the left and you can click the link right there and subscribe to Bitcoin Magazine Pro. I see a few of you DMing me about that. Sorry. Sam, let's dive deeper into this long-term holder realized price and realized price. I know that anytime historically we've reached Bitcoin's price has gone below this, those have been historic generational buying opportunities. It makes me very nervous, quite frankly, that those levels are still between 22 and 24,000, roughly just below 24,000. Let's dive into this chart and just sort of, what are you seeing? Is this that opportunity we've been waiting for, or is there still more bloodshed to come?
Yeah, totally. So there's a few charts you can get into. I mean, basically what it paints to me, I think you can make a good case for both in terms of bullish, bearish. Is there more bloodshed to come? Something like this, and a lot of this and on-chain too, you'll find like a cyclical nature of, just because this event has happened with a past and seems a pattern in Bitcoin's history, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen again. But some of these market behaviors have been reoccurring and are kind of what have played out before. So I think what you're seeing here in like two color-coded ways is like when you have the network cost basis, which is a realized price we talked about before, and then you have the long-term holder cost basis. And so what you would think of like if the realized cost basis is like rising on the network, essentially that's like capital inflow that's coming in, essentially pushing up that floor price. And that's kind of like the total realized price at large. And when you think of that going down, you think of like a lot of short-term holders that maybe bought months ago or bought at higher prices. They're essentially selling, pushes the realized price lower. And then essentially that's converging on like where the long-term holder cost basis is today. So like when we've seen this before, it's been these times of like bear market kind of drawn out periods where have been like those kind of mega accumulation or generational opportunity times to buy in Bitcoin's history. We look to be closing in on that a little bit further. And essentially, you think about long-term holder realized price is a little bit different than the cost basis of the network, because the nature of long-term holders, they're always holding, like they have lower cost basis in nature. So when this really rises, it's some selling from that too, older coins saying, okay, we're getting to this market, and is there going to be strong opportunity in the future, or should I take out and cash out now? And so we're seeing a little bit of that activity. On net, long-term holder supply is one of those things that fluctuates, but has grown. Now it's over 13 million coins, grown from 7 million over Bitcoin's life. So it's always growing and fluctuating. But what we're getting now is like when you sell some of these older coins that have been held for a long time, some of that cost basis gets pushed up. And so essentially you get to a point where the overall cost basis of the network is below that of long-term holders. Then you kind of go through this like accumulation period again. So it's just one of those signs that we've seen before in cyclical natures, and got a couple other charts to kind of show some of those cycles, just to show kind of this interesting point of where we're at today. And before, with kind of a Glassnode issue and realized price, we saw maybe this kind of mega capitulation in long-term holders. We're now kind of like seeing this steady rise in the floor price, but getting to a point where there's been a few times like in Bitcoin's history where you see price go below long-term holder realized price. It doesn't last long, maybe a month at a time. And those have really sparked those moments where like huge capitulation bottoms. So that's something in the past, not necessarily going to see that today. The next slide I have in here is looking at this just like realized price overall. And these are pretty subjective thresholds of like what we're looking at. So as I mentioned before, if you're looking at like the cost basis as a whole, you're saying like realized price is like the capital inflow that's coming into the network. So if that's coming in really steep, like over 10%, those are typically like your bullish FOMO parabolic type phases. If you have something like more in the neutral phase, not necessarily like a lot of capital is coming in, it's growing, Bitcoin's floor price is rising. And then on the reverse of that, you have maybe what you could call more bear market activity or territory, where essentially there's more selling on net at the market at higher prices that Bitcoin was bought up before, and maybe getting to that capitulation. And so you're seeing that decrease. So we like to look at it on like just a 30-day change basis. This doesn't necessarily tell you like what's going to happen over the next 30 days, kind of just tells you the state that we're in right now, which is more of that overall, the realized price, that floor that sets on Bitcoin, kind of pure monetization, has been declining over the last 30 days at a decent clip, and kind of in that state. And for me, I look at some signs to say that maybe there's more potential capitulation or more bear market territory to be had here.
Sorry, I didn't like the way it looked on the screen. One thing I want to point out really quickly during all this conversation that we're having, like all of these indicators, like it reminds me a lot of like oversold and overbought indicators in just technical trading with stocks. And one thing that like the very first thing I was ever taught when I started using oscillators was just because something is overbought, just because something is oversold, does not mean it can't get more overbought or more oversold respectively. And I think that's one big thing with all of these tools that you're showcasing to us here, Sam. Like just because it says it's a generational buying opportunity does not mean that it can't be even more generational. You bring up the fact that like historically when Bitcoin's price goes below long-term realized price, I believe it was you said, or realized price, that happens for a month. It doesn't just like sit there and like reverse back. So just a gentle reminder for everyone who's listening that like just because it says something doesn't necessarily guarantee it goes up from here. It could still go lower, but this is just a zone or a general area that you should take advantage of. I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great caveat and point. Obviously I'm someone who's trying to study the market. And so from one way on chain, it tells you a lot about the just general economic behavior and activity that's happening, and give you a lot of insights and information. And but necessarily too, it depends on how you use it. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to turn into trading signals, and we're not promoting that as well. And I think for most people too, it's a lot about just like information and wanting to understand. Like you have this really public, transparent ledger that is showing you this different economic behavior that I find interesting because you don't get it in other markets. So just from like an information insight standpoint, I find it that useful. In terms of like timing bottoms, a little bit of a fool's game, but I mean, there are areas and like entry points where you say, okay, I want to say, I'm going to put, if I'm thinking on Bitcoin from a long-term perspective, 5-10 years, I want to get the best entry zone I can get. Here are some confluence of on-chain indicators macro that I think is a good point to do. And I would say for most people to do, it just depends on like how you view the market and what you want to do for yourself. I go back to like Preston Pish probably has the best advice for most people is, take on a position, try to understand Bitcoin, and then like fall asleep for 5 years. So it really depends on what you're doing. But for those that are interested in the behavior and like activity, I think studying this can provide some pretty good insights, at least knowledge at the least.
Sam, we have just under 5 minutes left. I mean, this is what happens when I have too much fun talking to people smarter than me. Is there a slide you want to go over or any final points that we should discuss in our remaining time?
Yeah, why don't we just, I think, we could go over the kind of market value, realized value Z-score kind of chart last. I'd say for most people that are potentially not into on-chain or trying to understand some of it, there's a lot of great methodology and like statistics out there and math that's been done, and everyone's learning this in like real time. And so a lot of cool metrics out there been created, try to understand like economic behavior and activity. But I kind of look at, if you're just saying, okay, I want to know where the price action is today or where behavior is today, and you're holding Bitcoin and you're curious about that, I would say the Meyer multiple is a great tool for that, price over 200-day moving average, understanding that. And then the other one that's more Bitcoin focused, because we've talked a lot about realized value cost basis today, is market value, realized value. Z-score is just a normalization of that standard deviation of mean. And then this is kind of how Bitcoin has played out in cycles in the past. Not to say that it continues to do this. It's actually kind of dampened with volatility over time. Bitcoin gets these less explosive moves. But this ties back into the cost basis that we were talking about before. You can kind of see where price is related to its cost basis and how far off that is and where we're at today. So this has been a good cyclical indicator of trying to understand maybe where Bitcoin is at a top or a bottom, and kind of where we're at today is in like this 29th, 30th percentile, where essentially what you look for in bottoms, whether we get it or not, is that kind of price goes below that cost basis or potentially tested. So that number, that 23,000 number we were talking about before, can be some pretty good confluence when you think about like technical indicators of price or where it could go. So I like to tell people, this is something good to keep up with. If you're looking for like the downside case to be had, there's times through Bitcoin's history where we've seen this before. Price goes below the cost basis of the network. It's more of a bear style like market. So that's kind of like the scenario I like to paint for people, just to be prepared for in that situation based on some like kind of historical precedent and data.
A lot of stuff for us to oh wait, I need to put this mic. Sorry. A lot of stuff for us to digest. Sorry everyone on YouTube who's seeing me fumble with all of this. If you're not already following Sam Roll, but hopefully Dylan has